Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. The Rancher's Mistletoe Bride by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. Rocky River, Wyoming, 1880. Josie Watkins bustled around the dining room, clearing away the breakfast dishes as she did every morning. She listened intently as the other girls around her spoke fondly of their futures and made encouraging noises to help calm their nerves. While it wasn't officially part of her job, she had found that most of them appreciated a listening ear. Never mind that she didn't have personal experience of her own to share. It was enough just to nod and make them feel understood. Hearing other people's hopes and dreams of finding happiness with the hard-working ranchers and miners of the West was as much a part of her life as the endless chores she had to carry out for the family business. "We're going to get married by the end of the week, and then I can properly get started with my life out here." The latest girl, Grace, gushed. She held her hands to her chest and beamed with joy. "When I last wrote to him, I spoke fondly of Mistletoe Lodge, and he said that it sounds like I'm already in good hands." "That's kind of you to say so." Josie smiled at the feedback, storing it away at the back of her mind to relay to her parents later when she had a moment to spare. Her parents, Barton and Louise, had founded the Mistletoe Lodge Boarding House when they moved out west over 2 decades ago. It hadn't been their original plan, but the luck of the gold rush that had first enticed them west was erratic and ultimately didn't fall in everyone's favor. Barton had found that out the hard way, much to his bitter disappointment. "I say it to all our mail-order brides, but I have nothing but admiration for your bravery coming out here," Josie added. "I can't imagine what it must be like to leave everything you know behind. A miserable job in a garment factory and a drunken uncle demanding all the money I earned. Trust me, Josie, the choice wasn't too hard," Grace said, grimacing. "Even so, it's probably very different here from what you were used to in Boston." Josie tried and failed to imagine herself in the crowded, noisy streets of the city back east that Grace had described to her. The women who came to stay were from many different backgrounds. Some, like Grace, were escaping difficult situations, but there were plenty who left behind comfortable homes and wealthy families, purely looking for adventure and what they thought would be more freedom. In those instances, the realities of life in a frontier town were sometimes a rude awakening. The community might be close and folks were friendly, but it was hard work being a rancher's wife or living in a basic log cabin far out of town near the mines. "Our role is to help the ladies adjust to life out west," Josie's ma often used to remind her. The boarding house was a place for them to stay before ultimately joining the men whose advertisements they had answered months ago. Each girl that they housed was usually grappling with mixed emotions. One moment brimming with excitement, the next, understandably, a little fearful of what their new life might be like. Not to mention the small matter of marrying a man they only knew by exchanging letters. As Josie stacked up the dirty dishes, she paused to tuck a strand of her long, dark hair behind her ear and nodded along to what Grace was saying. "Are you going to be prepared to do all the cooking and cleaning for both of you?" Josie asked, cocking her head to the side. "I'm sure it will be fine," Grace shrugged off the question. Josie had a good instinct for when the girls in their care were underprepared for the life they were about to embark on. She didn't want to alarm them or put them off their rose-tinted view of the future, but felt a duty to gently point out that there would be plenty expected of them. "Did your ma teach you any recipes? The men here do appreciate a good home-cooked meal," Josie said, offering her advice. "My uncle used to say my beef stew is good," Grace said, when he was sober enough to notice. Josie managed a small smile to show her support, though inside she was concerned that poor Grace was going to be in for a rather large shock in her new life. "I'm sure your sweetheart will give you time to settle in with the chores. He sounds like a kind-hearted man from what you've told me about him." Grace's expression clouded slightly with worry. From what I've gathered from the letters so far, I could see myself falling in love with him. It sounded as though she was trying to convince herself as much as Josie. That's good, Josie said. Lots of girls come through here and find love with the man they've agreed to marry. I'm sure you're going to be one of them. Josie knew just what to say to the young women who looked uneasy and enjoyed reassuring them. Although it's ironic that they're looking to me for advice on preparing to be a wife when I've never so much as caught the eye of a suitable gentleman, let alone courted one. At almost 22 years old, the thought made Josie feel slightly wistful. As her ma said, the women would have to be dutiful and doting, but the reward of a happy marriage and life with a man who filled their heart with joy was worth the occasional moments of doubts and worries. I mean it. If you ever find yourself traveling east, just prepare yourself for the railway, Grace continued, still happily chattering on about romance. Is it really that bad? Josie asked, laughing because she'd heard the same story many times. You would have thought they'd find a way to stop the trains from juddering so much. I felt nauseous for most of the journey. I'm sorry to hear that, Grace. And I still feel nauseous when I think about meeting my love tomorrow, she admitted. I saw him briefly at the station, but luckily I had this place to retreat to. Everything is going to be different when I'm married, isn't it? I'm sure it will be different for the better, Josie reasoned. You can't stay here forever, as much as it would be nice to have you around. I know, Grace murmured. You will keep in touch, won't you? When you've got a man for yourself, I would love to hear how you get on with it all. Josie nodded, even though she knew it wouldn't be any time soon. Although she had always dreamt of falling in love and having the sort of loving marriage her parents enjoyed, she couldn't quite envisage herself with a man as much as she wanted to. It had never been a priority, nor had it even been a conversation with her mother and father. I promise to keep you informed, Josie said, forcing a smile onto her face to hide her uneasiness on the subject. So does that mean there isn't a man on the horizon? Grace asked, giving Josie an inquisitive look. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, and the fall sunshine caught her blue eyes. She was a beautiful woman, and Josie was aware of how dowdy her patched work dress looked by comparison. There's too much to do around here to even think of that. Ma and Pa need my help if the business is to be a success. Besides, Josie flushed self-consciously, I'm hardly going to attract a gentleman when I'm hidden away in the kitchen most of the day. She shrugged as though it didn't matter. Oh, what a silly thought. You're a beautiful young woman. You could have any man who walks through the door. Do you not realize that? Grace meant it as a compliment, but Josie felt heat rising to her freckled cheeks. Her parents had raised her with modest values, and beauty held little advantage in a family where the boarding house came before everything else. Her ma had drummed it into her that she had to be practical and able to turn her hands to all the chores. Beauty was too often equated to delicacy in Louise's mind, and her mother had reinforced to her that it simply wouldn't do. I'm happy where I am, Josie answered simply. It was almost true. Well, I think you should find a husband while you've still got the pick of the crop and beauty on your side, Grace declared, patting her own blonde ringlets. There are more and more girls arriving from the East Coast every day, and if you don't look out, they might snap up all the good men. It's not as if you're getting any younger. Josie hadn't thought of it like that. Of course, she wanted to marry someday, but the idea of all the men being taken was one she hadn't yet considered. As Josie warily finished washing the dishes after dinner that evening, her mind was still whirring with Grace's dire warning. She dried her hands on a towel, noticing that they looked work-worn compared to Grace's smooth skin. Although Louise said that looking in mirrors too often was vain, she caught her reflection in the window as the sun was setting. Her thick brown hair was a glossy chestnut color that matched her brown eyes, but again, it seemed plain compared to Grace. Many of the young women who stayed at Mistletoe Lodge had a more worldly air about them and dressed more fashionably than she did in her functional clothes. Although the air was cool outside, Josie was hot from the steaming water in the sink, and rushing to serve dinner to a new batch of guests who had arrived in the afternoon. Her gray calico dress stuck to her back as she placed the clean dishes down on the counter and let out a weary huff. "That's quite a sigh, Josie. A penny for your thoughts?" The comment came from Edith, who was their cook. She was kind-hearted, but had a sharp tongue if she felt it was deserved. Josie counted her as a friend and was grateful for her company when they were in the kitchen together. It helped the time pass quickly, although lately, Edith had been slowing down a little. Nobody knew her exact age, but she grumbled that the rheumatism in her gnarled hands was going to be worse than ever if they had a cold winter. "It's nothing. Here are the dishes." Josie put a pinch of tea leaves in the pot. "Why don't you sit down for a moment in your armchair, and I'll make you a cup of tea?" "Thank you, dear," Edith said. She took a pile of plates over to the wooden dresser and then sat down gratefully in her favorite chair in the corner of the kitchen. "I know that look. What's been troubling you?" Edith had traveled to Wyoming from Louisiana almost 10 years ago, a strong widow with a will to survive. Without her husband to support her, she had turned to what she was good at to keep herself going. Josie had always admired that in her. Edith's ability to carry on had worked so far, and she trusted the older woman greatly because of her experiences in life. "It's really nothing," Josie persisted. No matter the soft place in her heart that the cook had, Josie wasn't in the mood to talk. "Okay, but I don't want to see any moping around in my kitchen," Edith spoke in a slightly firmer tone. "It's just something Grace said to me earlier." Josie poured the tea out and handed Edith a cup. "Go on." "She was asking about my own luck with love. All I could say to her is that Ma keeps me so busy that I don't even have time to go out and find it for myself," Josie said. Her shoulders sagged as she spoke, and she had an air of defeat. "It's starting to feel like they don't want me to find a husband for myself and leave them. Think about everything that I do around here. Between serving the food, washing the sheets, dusting, and cleaning, and helping you in the kitchen, it's nonstop. They would have to hire someone to do all of that if I were to leave. I overheard Pa saying the other day that money is tight since they did the place up to add more rooms. And it's not that I'm afraid of hard work." Josie sighed. "I know I'm luckier than many people. I have a loving family and a job I enjoy, but sometimes I wonder whether this is all I'll ever do." "Now, child, I'm sure that's not what your ma intended for you." "I mean it, Edith. It feels like they don't want me to get married." Edith frowned and shook her head as she rubbed her arthritic hands. "I don't believe that for a second. Your parents have always been so in love. It's infectious, but it also made me miss my husband, George, a lot. Seeing them so happy and smitten with one another made me realize what I'd lost when I first started working here." She took a sip of tea and thought fondly back on her own marriage before continuing. "After a while, I came to appreciate it was a blessing, especially with all the young ladies just starting out in their own marriages. Your ma and pa show our brides-to-be that love can last. I know Louise and Barton wouldn't want you to miss out on experiencing such a thing either, Josie. They may be busy, and perhaps it would be hard to let you go, but they aren't cruel." Josie fanned herself and then started folding up the sheets, which had been airing over the stove. Keeping on top of the laundry was a never-ending task, and it would become even harder once winter arrived. She didn't know whether it was the heat belching out from the stove or all this talk about marriage that was making her feel too warm. Either way, she wished she had braided her long hair before starting with the day's work. Josie couldn't understand how Edith could stand it all day while wearing such a big apron. "I know they aren't knowingly cruel, but I also know that they need my help. Hearing all the guests talking about their futures, it just gets me thinking sometimes." Josie finally answered after wiping her brow with her forearm. Edith nodded, showing that she understood. "Your pa has always gone on about how much he wants the right man to marry his little girl. I know how much you hate it when he calls you that, but it's just more proof that he wants what's best for you." Josie narrowed her eyes. If he really wanted her to find the right sort of man, then surely he would be doing something about it. She would be 22 in a couple of weeks. Most women were courting or married already by her age, But her parents never mentioned her future in any terms other than their plans to expand Mistletoe Lodge and how grateful they were for her help. "I'm just tired of waiting," Josie went on to admit in a quiet voice. "I'm tired of having these thoughts that everyone else has a happy marriage to look forward to except me." She grabbed the folded sheets and hurried away to put them in the laundry press. "Will I ever meet a kind-hearted man to call my own?" The question was one that she couldn't answer, even though she hoped one day it would happen. As she trudged up the stairs, an idea suddenly came into her mind. It was a thought that caused her eyes to widen for a moment. She considered the women around her who stayed in the boarding house. Each of them had made the decision to go out and find the love they craved. "Maybe I should be more like them," she muttered to herself. She felt a sense of optimism, but also trepidation at the thought of taking matters into her own hands. But part of her felt that she deserved happiness and to find a husband who would love her as much as the other women in the boarding house. Surely, Ma and Pa would want me to have a marriage as happy as theirs? A plan was beginning to form the more she thought about it, and with it, a newfound motivation that had been missing in the past. Josie had waited too long. It was time to go out and find what she wanted. Chapter 2. Reuben Harris lifted his hat and let the crisp fall air cool his brow as he straightened up from the arduous task of heaving boulders to the edge of the paddock. He stood and looked across his land for a moment. Shadow Ranch. It was a name that filled him with pride, but also frustration. He had such big dreams for the place, but for now, it still lived up to its name, because the land was a shadow of what he wanted it to become. "Don't ever give up, son. If you work hard, you'll get there in the end." His mouth lifted into a smile as he recalled the words his pa often used to utter. It was true. Each day brought him closer to his dream of making a success of his ranch. He would love to be able to confidently say that he was always optimistic about his work, but that would have been a lie. Ever since the sudden death of his beloved parents 5 years ago, Reuben had known everything that followed would be hard. When all had seemed lost, the only ray of hope he'd had was coming out west. His pa had owned a small saloon in New York with a business partner, but Reuben had always yearned to live out on the vast frontier lands ever since he had first read about life out west in a book. The modest sum of money he had inherited was just enough to purchase Shadow Ranch. Even with his inexperience, he knew it was a tough plot of land to take on. It was strewn with rocks, and the scrubby bushes which had encroached after years of neglect made it hard to even see where one paddock ended and the next began. "But it's mine," Reuben reminded himself often. "Mine to make something of." Even though he had grown up in a neighborhood where crime was rife, he quickly learned that the world was tougher in different and more natural ways in Wyoming. The nearest town, Rocky River, was a good 2-hour ride away, and he had learned to like his own company because there was no other choice. Reuben was determined to make this work. He hadn't moved across the country for nothing. But during the long winter the year before, he had finally admitted to himself that it was all becoming rather laborious and lonely. His soul yearned for someone to be by his side. A wife who he could come home to after a long day outside, who he could share his hopes and dreams with. He had found himself thinking about it more and more, to the point where his work had started to feel pointless if he didn't have a family of his own. The thought of watching his own children growing up on Shadow Ranch, the pride of teaching them to ride and love this land as much as he did. Every time the idea that he might never have that slid into his mind, it felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The sound of hoofbeats approaching caught his attention, and he spotted his neighbor, Wallace Bright. The old man had been born and bred out west and had also seen the expansion of the area as people like him moved from the east. Reuben couldn't imagine what it must have been like to watch an area change so much. Wallace's skin was swarthy and lined from many years working outside, and one of the first things that he had given Reuben was a broad-brimmed hat to protect his head from the harsh summer sun. It was the hat he still wore to this day, and now he lifted it in greeting as Wallace dismounted and strolled over toward him. "Looks like you're getting on well, clearing those rocks," Wallace called to him in the late afternoon sun. "It's a thankless task, but at least once it's done, and you won't have to worry about your cattle going lame. Nothing worse than losing a good animal because it's injured from running over boulders." Reuben smiled over at his neighbor and nodded his head. "I don't have many flighty animals, thanks to you helping me breed from the calm cattle, but I guess it only takes a bear or cougar prowling around to spook them. I was just thinking how grateful I am for all the help you've given me over the years." Reuben smiled as he walked over to the small fence that separated their lands. He owed a lot to Wallace, who had patiently shown him the ropes when he first arrived. Thanks to what he had learned from his neighbor, Reuben was raising a small herd of cattle, expanding it little by little each year, and they were finally starting to turn into the sort of stock that commanded a good price at the sales. He also had a handful of horses that he broke in to sell. It required more work than rearing the cattle, but Reuben had found that it was the most rewarding and paid well. "You don't have to flatter me like that, boy. You should know that by now," Wallace said with a chuckle. "In any case, I'm glad you're making a success of this land. It's been vacant for so long that it's good to see a bit of activity going on around here." Reuben had thought several times about packing up and moving to Rocky River to find a job that suited him more when the labor got tough. He knew enough about running a saloon that he would probably be able to make a go of it. But ranching was where his heart lay, and he was pleased that he'd managed to stick it out for as long as he had. Things were beginning to look up in more ways than one. "Say, when's your girl getting into town?" Wallace asked as if reading his mind. Reuben couldn't help but smile. He had known the old man was bound to ask about that. One night the previous winter, when Wallace had come over to visit Reuben to return some tools that he had borrowed, talk had turned to marriage, and Wallace had reminisced about his late wife, his eyes misting over with emotion. "It's hard to work the land without a wife by your side," he had said, giving Reuben a shrewd glance. "Isn't it about time you started courting? I can tell you're lonesome, stuck out here on your own." "Where am I going to meet a good woman, let alone have time for courting?" Reuben had joked, trying to ignore the fact that Wallace's comment had hit home. "I only go into Rocky River a couple of times a month for supplies and come straight home again." Wallace had just chuckled. "You're not wriggling out of it that easily. You need to get yourself along to the matrimonial bureau. Mrs. Devereaux, who runs it, will help you place an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. If I was still a young man, that's what I would do. But I'm content with my own company now, knowing that I was blessed with a good marriage for all those years." After a bit more persuading, Reuben had reluctantly followed Wallace's suggestion, even though he felt torn between engaging in a service like this and trying to find a woman the old-fashioned way. "There are more horses than women around these parts," Wallace often joked, and Reuben knew he was speaking the truth, which was why he had all but given up hope of settling down and marrying. He hadn't really expected anything to come of placing the advertisement in the paper, and even found himself wondering if it was a waste of money that could have been better spent elsewhere. But he had simply wanted to appease Wallace. Which was why it was such a surprise when he received a reply. The last thing that Reuben had been expecting was for a woman like Catherine Longman to write back to him. What was even more surprising was that he knew Catherine was the one for him remarkably early on in their correspondence. Over the months they had been writing to each other, he had come to see that she was kind and sweet. She shared her hopes of living a quiet life away from the grime and poverty of the tenement building where she lived and the monotonous work that filled her days. Reuben could imagine all too well what it was like because he had felt exactly the same. Catherine wanted to escape, and Reuben knew just the place where she could come. Of course, he had warned her early on that his log cabin was basic and that life on the ranch was hard work. But Catherine had countered that she didn't care. "She'll be here tomorrow," Reuben responded, unable to hide the smile on his face. "Good. And you've got everything ready?" "I've cleaned the house and filled the pantry with food. although I expect she'll want to make the place more cozy. She's staying at a boarding house in Rocky River first, and I've booked Pastor Franklin to marry us in a few days' time, so I still have a little while before she sees the house." Wallace chuckled before glancing up the small hill to Reuben's timber house. It was a modest structure, the kind that would do for now, but could be extended if they had a large family. Reuben knew that when the time came, he was going to have to do something about that, but he had only just managed to pay for Catherine to travel by train and stagecoach across the country so that she could marry him. Everything else would simply have to wait. "I'm very happy for you, Reuben. You're a kind man, and it's about time you had a nice wife to share your life with. It sure will be nice to have a young lady around these parts," Wallace said, still smiling. "She'll have the place turned into a proper home in no time, and you'll wonder why you waited so long." "You'll be the first person we invite over for dinner," Reuben replied. "I honestly don't think I would have survived these tough first years without your help, Wallace." "You'd have done all right," the old man replied. He unhitched his horse and swung himself up into the saddle again. "There aren't many men who would risk it all, turning down working your pa's saloon to come out west. It takes grit and determination to tame this land, and you've got plenty of that. And before long, you'll have a family too, which will make it all the more worthwhile." Reuben didn't feel brave. There were many times when he'd wondered if he was a fool for embarking on the risky venture of setting up his own ranch from nothing. "Come over and meet Catherine as soon as you can," he called after Wallace as his horse loped away. He felt his spirits lift as he returned to the boulders that still needed to be stacked in a gap in the fence. Everything would be easier once he met his wife-to-be. At least, that was what he'd been telling himself since he had sent his marriage proposal a month earlier. Chapter 3. A new arrival to the boarding house always prompted a flurry of activity. There weren't many times when Josie felt like it was too much to manage, but she could distinctly remember once when they'd had 6 women arriving on the same day. It had been a challenge to show each of them around, while also making sure their beds were made up and that they felt settled and welcome. But she had gotten it done just fine. Josie remembered rushing Edith to have enough food prepared, something that the cook hadn't taken kindly to. Josie enjoyed the bustle of it all normally. She liked that she was helping these young and often naive women arriving in a part of the country that would have been strange to them. She hoped that she made them all feel at least a little more comfortable about what they were going through. She hummed as she worked, thinking about how the year went in a predictable cycle she had grown accustomed to. Now that it was fall, they had the usual surge of women deciding to travel west in search of a husband before the harsh winter weather might make the journey too difficult. "How are you getting on up there?" Louise's voice drifted up the stairs. "Almost finished, Ma," Josie called back. She plumped up the feather pillows and whisked a duster around the room. The woman who had been in it before had gotten married that morning, and the faint scent of her rosewater still hung in the air. Josie had helped pin her hair into ringlets, nodding along as the woman told Josie how excited she was to start her new life out at the mines. There had been a few tears as she admitted to feeling homesick for her younger sisters, but they had soon passed. Josie rubbed a cloth over the windows until they sparkled, and then turned her attention to buffing lavender beeswax polish on the dressing table. She was deep in thought about her recent conversation with Edith when she heard the rumble of a wagon approaching, followed by shouting, "Louise! Barton! Where are you?" Josie rushed to the window to peer out, wondering what was happening. Whatever it was sounded urgent. She was surprised to see that it was the stagecoach driver, an older man who arrived almost every week without fail with 1 or 2 new guests. "What's he doing here so early?" she muttered to herself. They had been expecting him the following morning. Although they often had guests turning up unannounced, Mr. Fritz was usually as regular as clockwork. Thursday morning, just in time for a cup of coffee from Edith, who he always said looked more charming than ever, making her turn pink from the attention. Something must have happened. Josie knew that he must have driven the coach through the night to have made the journey in such time. which meant it must be something urgent. She rushed down the stairs, catching sight of her mother at the door, trying to calm Mr. Fritz down. "She's deathly sick," the driver was calling to her mother, wringing his hands with worry. "I pushed the horses to their limit to get here as quickly as I could, Louise." "Thank you, James. Here's some extra money for your trouble," her mother said calmly while placing 2 coins into his palm. Josie could tell that her main concern was the woman in the coach. "I can help," Josie spoke up, wanting to make it known that she was there. "Thank you." Louise gestured for Josie to follow them outside. She was a little pale when I collected her from the train, and she wasn't very talkative. But look at her now. Mr. Fritz swung the stagecoach door open, rather hesitantly. Josie could see the other passengers waiting patiently, but sitting as far away from the sick woman as they could. She didn't blame them. Nobody yet knew if this was contagious. "All I know is that her name is Catherine Longman," he added. "Yes, we were expecting her," Josie's mother nodded quickly. "Let's get her out and see if that helps." Mr. Fritz scrambled into the coach, tucking his hands under Catherine's arms and carefully lifting her out. "She's gotten worse since I last checked on her." Josie picked up the bags he had already unloaded and felt a surge of worry at the sight of the pale woman in Mr. Fritz's arms. Her eyes were unfocused and blank, as though she could barely hold on to consciousness. "Where am I?" she mumbled. She had dark hair that framed her pallid face, but it hung limply, and her head lolled against his chest. "Hush now, Miss Longman. You're at Mistletoe Lodge now, and we'll take good care of you." Louise gave the woman a kind smile, which seemed to soothe her slightly. "Josie will prepare the room in the eaves for you. It will only take a few minutes, and then you can rest." Louise darted a look in Josie's direction, not needing to explain that it was the room furthest from the rest of the women. They needed to keep their new arrival separate from everyone else, somewhere that would be more private for her to recover, or to stop her illness from spreading if it came to the worst. Josie worked quickly and efficiently. Several of the other women tried to ask what was happening as the sound of the urgent conversations between Louise and Mr. Fritz drifted through the house, but Josie waved them away, saying that it was nothing they needed to be concerned about. She tucked clean sheets onto the bed and flung the windows open to let the fresh air in. A moment later, the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs got louder, and her pa and Mr. Fritz appeared on the landing with Catherine between them. They laid her carefully on top of the bed, and Josie stepped out of the way to make space in the small attic room, which suddenly felt crowded. Louise bustled in with a jug of water and an armful of towels, which she placed on the dresser. "I know it's chilly outside, but we had better leave the window open for now," she said, giving Josie a quick nod of approval that her daughter had thought of it. "We need to keep the room aired until we know what's wrong with her." Josie's heart squeezed with pity as she stared down at Catherine. She could tell by her shallow breathing and pallid gray complexion that she was seriously ill. Her forehead was beaded with droplets of sweat, and her eyelids fluttered as though she were in a disturbing dream. "I'm going to fetch the doctor," Barton said from the doorway. "Josie, if you could get on with serving lunch for the other guests, that would be helpful. We don't want everyone to panic, or goodness knows what it could do for the reputation of the business." A shadow of worry crossed his face. It had taken them years of hard work to make Mistletoe Lodge a success, and he prided himself on how popular it was for single women. He didn't want anyone to feel unsafe or that their wedding had been spoiled by sickness. "Of course, Pa, and I'll show him upstairs when he arrives. I know you have errands to run in town." Josie nodded quickly, wanting to ease the look of worry on Barton's face. She hurried away after one final look at Catherine. Louise was gently mopping her brow, and Josie hoped that it might go some way to help the young woman get better, knowing that she was being taken care of. "This way, Dr. Mundy." Josie guided the doctor up the narrow stairs half an hour later. Mr. Fritz had already left. He'd done his job, so there was no point in him being there anymore, and he had other women to drop off. "Do you know what condition she's in?" Mundy asked as he walked ponderously up the stairs behind her. The doctor was stooped with a wiry frame and bushy white eyebrows. Although he came across as rather stern, his pale blue eyes were kind behind his spectacles. Josie had known him for years, and she knew he would take good care of Catherine. "Not right now. I've been downstairs doing my chores," Josie explained. "When she came in, she didn't look good. I don't think she was actually conscious." The doctor nodded and made a non-committal sound. "Too many of these young women are leaving places of terrible poverty behind when they travel out west," he mumbled to himself. "It's a wonder more of them aren't ill, to be honest. She's just through that door." Josie gestured to the room in the eaves. "We've kept her away from the other guests," she added, lowering her voice. "Very wise." The doctor let himself in and closed the door behind him. While curiosity and worry gnawed at Josie, and she wanted to follow him into the room, she knew that it wasn't her place. Her ma was still there, tending to Catherine, so there was plenty she needed to be getting on with. However, Josie found herself lingering at the door once the doctor had shut it behind him. She strained her ears to listen out for anything that might indicate Catherine was going to be all right. But it was impossible to hear anything other than the intermittent low rumble of Dr. Mundy's voice as he examined her. Josie went about the rest of her afternoon as she had planned to. She busied herself with cleaning up the dining room and sweeping the entrance hall before dragging the rugs outside to beat the dust from them. The activity helped to put the worry out of her mind. Catherine was in good hands now, so there was nothing she could do. And she would simply have to wait. "What do you think is wrong with her?" Josie overheard one of the guests ask. The women in the boarding house had gathered in the garden to take a stroll and admire the view of the distant mountains. "It's some kind of fever," one woman replied assertively. "I saw plenty of sickness back in 5 Points. She had that sort of look about her." "Cholera, do you think?" Another lady sounded alarmed, and Josie saw her digging her handkerchief out of her reticule to press to her mouth. "I hope it's nothing catching. Imagine coming all this way to get married and not even having a chance to meet your fiancé." The third woman fanned herself, darting worried looks toward the upstairs room where they knew Catherine was. The women fell silent for a moment as they thought about it. Cholera was an illness that had touched them all in one way or another. Most people knew of someone close or distant to them who had succumbed to the disease. If the girl had brought cholera to their house, Josie knew that there was a high chance they were all already doomed. "I'm sure it's not cholera," Josie called, hurrying over to reassure them. "Dr. Mundy would have sent my ma out of the room if that was the case, but he's happy that she's in there looking after Miss Longman. Would you like a cup of tea and some of Cook's fruit cake? Tell me how your plans are going for your weddings." Josie deftly changed the topic of conversation, and the women were soon happily talking about their own plans again, forgetting about the doctor's visit, much to her relief. Less than an hour later, Dr. Mundy and Louise emerged from the attic room and came downstairs. "How is she, Ma?" Josie knew she should wait to be told, but she had to know. There was something so pitiful about a young woman who looked so ill when she had traveled for a better future for herself. Dr. Mundy's expression was grave. "I believe she has pneumonia. That's the closest thing that I could diagnose her symptoms to. Probably exacerbated by a poor diet and being overworked in one of the dreadful factories, breathing in rotten air all day long. But it's good that it's not cholera, isn't it? We'll be able to nurse her back to good health, surely?" Josie wanted to believe that the clean air of Wyoming and Edith's wholesome food would make the difference Catherine needed. Louise rested her hand on Josie's arm and shook her head sorrowfully. "Dr. Mundy said that we must prepare ourselves for the fact that she might not last more than a week. She's been ill for a while. It's just that Mr. Fritz didn't realize it." Poor Catherine. Josie felt a pang of regret for the new beginning that the young woman would never experience. "We'll do everything we can to make her comfortable." Louise offered her a small but comforting smile as she nodded her head. "Josie, we were thinking that you could sit with her for a while. I don't mind taking on some of your jobs, but we thought it would be best for her to talk with someone her own age in her final days." Her final days. The words were bleak. Josie's eyes widened at the request. While on the surface it sounded like a fairly innocent task, she understood the gravity of what was really being asked of her. "Are you sure, Ma?" Josie whispered. "What if I say the wrong thing?" "You're a kind-hearted girl, and I know the Lord will guide you to say what Catherine will find comforting," Dr. Mundy said, patting Josie's arm. "She's drifting in and out of consciousness, so she might not hear everything. But I want to reassure you that when someone is as ill as she is, having a chance to talk can be a very great blessing." Chapter 4. As Josie walked quietly up the stairs, her thoughts turned to what the doctor had just said. Did she really have the compassion required to help Catherine? She paused on the landing and stood at the window for a moment. Outside in the distance, she could see the rich jewel-like colors of the trees and the jagged peaks of the mountains beyond Rocky River. It reminded her that help was there if she needed it, and she closed her eyes. "Lord, please give me the courage to help Catherine however she needs, and to speak words that will ease her suffering at this sad time. I pray that you will soothe her heart, and that her final days will be filled with your merciful love. Amen." Josie felt a sense of peace and calmness enter her mind, as she always did when she turned to her faith. Although she knew she made mistakes often, God never let her down, and she smiled again, as though seeing for the first time what a great honor it would be to serve Catherine in this way. It might be that her job was to clean and cook and make beds for young women before they became brides, but now her task was to help nurse a very sick woman close to her in age. She took a deep breath and turned to face the door, knocking quietly. "Hello?" Josie spoke into the darkening room. A small oil lamp had been dimmed and sat on the nightstand, illuminating the pale form on the bed. Her skin shone with a sheen of perspiration, and Josie fixed a smile on her face so as not to show her worry to the poor woman. "My name's Josie. I'm Louise and Barton's daughter. I help out here at the boarding house," Josie said while sitting down on the chair next to her bed. "Catherine," the girl managed to breathe out. "I'm Catherine. How are you feeling?" Josie wished she could bite the words back, hearing how trite they sounded in her own ears. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, her lips slowly curling up to a brief smile of disbelief. "I've never been better," she responded dryly, making Josie shuffle uncomfortably in the chair. Her eyes opened, and she gave Josie an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, that was uncalled for. I know you're just being polite. I actually do feel a bit better than I was in the stagecoach. It was so uncomfortable, I just wanted the journey to end." "I'm so sorry this is happening to you," Josie blurted out by way of a reply. She wondered whether she was going to be any help after all. "We're all holding you in our prayers. Who knows? Sometimes people recover against all odds." "That is kind of you to say," Catherine wheezed. "But there's no hope. I could see it in the doctor's face when he diagnosed me. I know what pneumonia is, and I know I don't have much longer." Josie could only nod as she pressed her lips together. It was a harsh truth, but it was good that Catherine seemed to be accepting her fate. It was hard to strike the right balance between being kind and not giving her false hope. "Who were you coming out here to see? Is anyone expecting you?" Josie asked hesitantly, trying to divert the subject away from the current situation. Catherine's booking letter for her room had been brief, but Josie had assumed it was to Mary, like most of their guests. "I was invited out by a rancher," Catherine said. "We were meant to be getting married." Her weary voice was like listening to a whisper on the wind. It was almost impossible to hear. "His name is Reuben Harris. He was going to meet me here tomorrow. I think he lives someplace outside of Rocky River, but I'm not sure." Josie could see that even just explaining all of this was taking a lot out of her. "Would you like me to try and get in touch with him?" Josie asked, seizing upon something practical that she could do for her. "I'll get him here so that he can see you." "I'm not so sure about that," Catherine said softly, her mouth twisting with regret. "He's never met me in person before. Do you really think he's going to want to see the woman he was thinking of marrying looking like this, on my deathbed?" Her plain way of talking reminded Josie of herself. It was how she thought about a lot of things, although she had to remember to phrase things more politely when speaking to other people. Her heart went out to the girl in front of her. "I think a decent man would want the chance," she replied firmly. You know him best, of course, but if he has a shred of kindness, he would be more concerned about how you feel than worrying about how you look." "You're right," Catherine said. "From what little I know of him, he does seem like a decent man, and I think he probably would want to be here. I was just being vain. Let me think about it for a bit longer." "It's a very brave thing to come all the way out here," Josie remarked. "I know I certainly wouldn't have the courage to leave everything I know, to leave my home and travel to the other side of the country." "I didn't really have much to leave behind." Catherine shrugged from her position in the bed. Josie thought about the small case that the stagecoach driver had handed to her. Like so many of the young women arriving here, Catherine didn't have much to her name. Josie held a glass of water to her lips, and Catherine had a few sips before falling back on the pillows again. The small effort was almost too much for her. She closed her eyes for a moment to summon some more strength before continuing. "I think I would like Reuben to be here, but not yet. Tomorrow, maybe. Let me have one night here first to see if I get better. He has been so good to me in his letters. He sounds like a real gentleman." She sighed quietly. "I was looking forward to the future that I had envisioned for the two of us, to be someone's wife. Well, I suppose that is the dream for all of the women here." "I would certainly like it," Josie nodded, sharing her innermost thoughts without thinking. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be talking about myself," she said hastily, feeling guilty. "No, go on. What more can I do than chat with you?" Catherine's eyes looked slightly brighter as though the conversation was intriguing her. "You look about my age. Are you not courting or married?" Now it was Josie's turn to shrug. "Not yet. I work here and help women who are about to fulfill that same hope almost every day. It would be nice if I had some luck of my own in finding a husband, but there never seems to be time to do anything more than daydream about it." Josie wasn't sure why she was admitting such a thing to someone she had just met, but Catherine seemed kind and understanding. Under different circumstances, Josie thought they might have been good friends. She made her feel comfortable. Even her stoic acceptance of her fate was something that Josie found admirable. Josie imagined being as brave as Catherine. She felt as though she had never done anything out of the ordinary in her whole life, and certainly nothing as bold as traveling across the country and marrying a man who she had only spoken to in letters. Josie tried to envision herself doing something daring like that. It worked for so many of their guests to secure a match, but could it work for her? Nothing was set in stone, and Josie was slowly coming to the realization that she could still change the path that she was on. "I'm sure that the Lord will help you find true love," Catherine responded peacefully. There was a look in her eyes that told Josie she was accepting of her own fate. It was a sad acceptance, one that made Josie realize just how unfair the entire situation was, but she knew it wasn't her place to question the Lord's path for Catherine. The two young women talked through the long night, about Catherine's life and the hopes and dreams she held. As the lamplight flickered, keeping the shadows at bay, a bond grew between them that transcended the fact that they had only just met. It was a friendship born from desperation and revealing their secrets to each other, and Josie could only hope that somehow it was giving Catherine some comfort. As the hours ticked by and night turned into the following day, she wished there was more she could do to help in the little time Catherine had left. "I think it's time now," Josie said eventually. "I'll speak with my parents, and we'll find Reuben and bring him here. At least we can do that for you." "Thank you," Catherine whispered, her eyes closing for a brief moment. Her breathing sounded labored, and Josie worried that perhaps she was talking too much. She should let her rest instead. "Before you go, could you pass me the letters that are in my carpet bag? They are from Reuben. I want to read them again while I still can. I used to look forward to receiving them so much while we were corresponding. I never dared dream that he would propose to me." Catherine's eyes grew heavy as the clock ticked quietly on the mantel shelf. Josie knelt down and opened the bag. It felt wrong to look through Catherine's belongings, but she persevered, and a moment later, her fingers closed around a bundle of letters. She pulled them out and saw that Catherine had tied them with a pink ribbon. "Don't be too long," Catherine said, giving Josie a grateful smile. "I promise I'll be as quick as I can." Josie placed the letters under Catherine's limp hand and brushed a lock of her hair off her forehead, thinking about how unfair it was that the love between Catherine and her sweetheart would never have a chance to flourish. As she tiptoed out of the room, she glanced back to see her wiping away the tears of regret which had finally started to roll down her cheeks. Chapter 5. Josie loved the feeling of the wind on her face as she rode her chestnut mare, Dawn. It was one of the times she felt truly free, and it gave her an escape from all the chores and expectations of what her parents wanted from her. "Let's go, Dawn." Josie only had to touch her heels against the horse's flanks for her to leap into a steady lope or surge into a gallop if she gave the mare her head. Louise and Barton had agreed that Josie should ride out to Shadow Ranch in search of Reuben, as they didn't want to leave the boarding house unattended. They knew she was sensible and wouldn't take any risks, as she knew the land around Rocky River like the back of her hand. Honoring Catherine's dying wish to find the man she was supposed to marry was the right thing to do, they all felt. And so Josie had saddled up immediately. The ride took longer than Josie anticipated, but it was no hardship with the magnificent rolling countryside all around her. The horse was quick and agile, so she knew they were going as fast as possible. It gave her some time alone with her thoughts as she wondered if she would ever get to talk about a man with the kind of hope in her heart that Catherine possessed. Even racked with pneumonia, her eyes had gleamed with affection, and her mouth had curled up into a smile that she couldn't stop. "Is there anyone out there for me? A man who will show me what it feels like to be cherished." She tried not to feel anxious about her future as the thoughts flitted through her mind. All that mattered at the moment was Catherine. As Dawn clopped along the winding, dusty trails with her ears pricked forward, Josie noticed the landscape starting to change. The properties were further apart, and where there had been mainly fields of crops nearer to town, now there was more grassland. The bleached grass rippled in the breeze, past its lush summer best, and she saw sturdy animals grazing everywhere she looked. She was deep into cattle country, which meant she was probably not far from arriving at her destination. At last, after following the twisting route, the track started to rise toward the bottom of the mountain, and a wooden sign hung on a post swung in the breeze with a slight squeak. Shadow Ranch. It was just where the sheriff had described when Josie had ridden quickly into town to ask if he knew where the place was. She gazed around, noticing the neat fencing and a mound of rocks on the corner of the nearest paddock. Although it didn't look like the best land in the area, she could tell that Mr. Harris was working hard to make the best of it. Turning up the track, she urged Dawn to trot faster, pushing aside any nerves about visiting a man on his ranch without a chaperone. He might be surprised for a few seconds, but he would soon understand why she had come. A moment later, she spotted a small log cabin, and a sudden flurry of thoughts came into her mind now that she had arrived. What if he doesn't believe me? Or what if he's not at home? Josie hadn't considered until that moment that her journey might be for nothing. But in the remote landscape, with nothing to see but grass, trees, and the small log cabin at the end of the track, it was now a very real possibility. She took a deep breath and continued. She couldn't let Catherine down by losing her nerve at the last minute. After dismounting her horse, Josie held her hand up to keep the sun out of her eyes and gazed around. There was nobody there. "Hello? Is there anyone home?" Her voice rang out, echoing slightly as it bounced off the side of the rough-hewn barn. "Mr. Harris, are you here?" she called a bit louder. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the barn doorway and came striding toward her. "I'm Reuben Harris," the man replied. The brim of his hat was low, casting a shadow over his face that pulled his features into obscurity. Josie had to wait until he was nearly by her side before she could finally see what he looked like. She'd vaguely heard the name before, but she'd never seen him with her own eyes. His dark hair could just be seen curling around the edges of his hat, and his warm brown eyes were staring at her with confused curiosity. Josie felt her stomach flip with nerves under his direct gaze. He raised his eyebrows. "Can I help you with something?" His voice was deep, and it pulled her from her thoughts as Josie realized that she had yet to respond to him. "Yes, I've come from Mistletoe Lodge, the boarding house in Rocky River," Josie stuttered. "My name is Josie Watkins, and I've come with some news." She realized too late that she hadn't prepared herself for how she was going to break such bad news to the hopeful-looking man before her. "Rocky River? That's a coincidence. That's where I'm headed shortly to pick up my wife-to-be." Josie could see the excitement in his eyes begin to change as her presence in front of him was starting to properly register. Her stomach felt hollow as she realized how tough this was going to be. "Did you just say you're from Mistletoe Lodge?" Reuben continued. He looked puzzled. "That's where she's staying until we marry. Is there a problem?" "Catherine Longman, is that who you're going to see?" Josie asked, seeing him nod quickly. "Yes, but how do you know that?" Josie let out a long breath and hesitated, wanting to break the news gently. She slowly looked up and met his eyes. "Catherine arrived yesterday. I'm afraid she's very ill, and the doctor says that she hasn't got long left. I'm so sorry to have to deliver such terrible news to you. I know this can't be easy. She wants to see you before it's too late, and so I was wondering if you would ride back with me now?" Josie could see the confusion melting into pain on his face. Reuben was clearly trying to make sense of it all. His mouth was moving, but no sound came from it. He took his hat off, absent-mindedly running his hand through his hair. "I don't understand. She can't be ill. We're getting married this week, you see." He shook his head, still in denial. "The doctor had diagnosed pneumonia, but he says it's the worst case he's seen in a while. I sat with her last night, and I don't know how much longer she'll survive," Josie said honestly. She knew that there was no point in trying to make it sound as though his sweetheart would be okay. It was a hopeless cause. She reached out and gently touched his arm to snap him out of his confusion. "Will you ride with me? We might not have much time." "Of course," Reuben blinked and nodded quickly. His eyes were darting around, looking at the ground in front of him as though he were trying to find a solution to what was happening. "Yes, we must ride at once." He strode away, already calling his gelding, which trotted up to the fence at the sound of his master's voice. Josie was riding quickly on her mare, but Reuben was more than able to keep up with her pace. Now that she knew the way, she wanted to return to the boarding house as fast as she could, just in case Catherine's condition took a turn for the worse and they would miss her final moments. Something in her gut told her they had no time to waste. "I still can't believe this is happening," Reuben muttered. "How could she have fallen so ill? Do you think it was the stress of the journey which caused it?" He looked anguished at the idea that his marriage proposal had somehow caused Catherine's grave situation. "No," Josie said hastily. "You mustn't blame yourself. The doctor said it was most likely something she caught before leaving, maybe even from working in a poor environment. But we must be thankful that the stagecoach driver was able to get her to us so quickly. He wanted to do the right thing, and hopefully it means that you will be able to see her, even if it's just for a little while." She risked a glance to her side, where Reuben's rugged features were set in a worried frown. Catherine had said he sounded good-looking from his letters, and she suddenly felt her cheeks flushing as she silently agreed. In any other situation, she would have found his brooding good looks attractive, but now her heart went out to him. Instantly, she felt ashamed of herself for having such a thought. It wasn't right for her to be thinking about such superficial things, and she felt a wave of guilt crash over her. Reuben was in love with someone else, and worse, he was a man who was about to lose the woman he had been longing to marry. She shook her head and continued to keep her gaze straight, not letting it waver for another moment and vowing to pray for forgiveness. Clearly, not having any sleep the night before and spending so much time with women who were always on the cusp of marriage and love had affected her mind. "I hope we're not too late," Reuben spoke up after a little while. The town of Rocky River was coming into view, the land around them becoming populated with more houses. "She's strong. I know she will hold on for you," Josie said. Of course, there was no way she could know such a thing for sure, but she wanted to reassure him and ease the pain that shadowed his eyes. They arrived promptly at the boarding house. and Reuben vaulted off his horse, throwing the reins over a hitching post. "She's in the bedroom under the eaves. I'll show you up there," Josie called. Reuben was already striding away from her, and she scrambled to dismount and tie Dawn up next to his horse. "Reuben, thank goodness you've come." Louise rushed out and ran down the steps. "Come this way. She's asking for you." She took hold of his arm and hurried inside with him. A few minutes later, Josie walked slowly up the stairs after him. She had been driven by urgency on the ride to fetch Reuben, but now she felt the weight of sadness on his behalf already settling over her. At the top of the stairs, Josie noticed that Catherine's door was open. She hesitated for a moment as she heard muffled voices from within. This was clearly going to be a difficult moment for them both, and the last thing that Josie wanted was to be in the way. She shifted on the spot, causing the old wooden floorboards beneath her feet to creak. The voices inside stopped talking for a moment, and Josie knew that the only sensible thing to do was to reveal herself. "I'm sorry," she said quietly as she pushed her hair back behind her shoulders. "I just wanted to come and check that you found her all right, and ask if there's anything you would like." Josie felt humbled by the scene in front of her. Catherine was sitting up in bed, though her condition had clearly worsened in her absence, and Reuben was sitting at the side of the bed. He held her frail hands in his, and his expression was tender. "Josie, please stay with me." Catherine's voice was weak, but Josie remained where she stood in the doorway. "I really don't want to intrude on your privacy with Reuben," Josie said, hoping that she would understand. It felt wrong for her to be here when they might only have a matter of hours together. "I'll make you a cup of coffee, but for now, you must spend some time with each other." "Please, Josie, you've been so kind to me since I arrived, and you are the only two people that I have in this world," Catherine said. She smiled, but Josie could see the glimmer of hope that had been in her eyes the day before was now gone. Catherine looked resigned to her fate. It broke her heart, but Josie knew that the inevitable was coming for her. "I will be back in a moment. There are some things I must attend to, and then I'll come and sit with you." Josie excused herself and hurried away. It wasn't a complete lie. Josie hadn't been able to get through any of her jobs for the morning because of going to find Reuben, but her daily chores were the last thing on her mind at that moment. With a heavy heart, she slipped through the house so the other women wouldn't stop her to ask what was happening, and found the solitude she craved on the bench under the apple tree in the back garden. She sat down in a daze and felt sadness welling up inside her. She knew that Catherine didn't have long left, and it filled her with grief. Josie had known plenty of neighbors in town who had died, but there was something about the snuffing out of Catherine's dreams that touched a chord deep in her heart. She wanted to support her new friend, but she didn't know if she had the courage to witness life slipping away from her in front of her eyes. "Please guide me, O Lord." She whispered the words and felt a sense of peace wrap itself around her again. She would sit with Catherine because giving her that comfort in her final hours was the right thing to do. She took a deep breath and then shivered at the feel of a light touch on her shoulder. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." Reuben's brown eyes were sorrowful, and he gave her a worried smile. "She's asking for you again. I don't think she has long left." His voice sounded choked with emotion, and Josie followed him back inside, knowing that the end was near. Chapter 6. Josie pulled another chair up to Catherine's bedside and sat down quietly while Reuben did the same on the other side of the bed. She could see the wretched emotions chasing across his face as he was trying to come to terms with what was happening, and she gave him a small nod of understanding. "Are you comfortable, Catherine? Is there anything I can get you?" Josie knew that her questions were of little consequence, but the silence in the room was oppressive, and she hoped it would lighten the moment. She needed to stay calm and collected for Catherine's final hours. Catherine's eyes fluttered open, and it took her a moment to realize that Josie was there. But when she did, her smile was heartfelt, and Josie had a glimpse of the beautiful woman she would have been if illness hadn't hollowed out her cheeks. "Thank you for going and finding Reuben," Catherine said to her. Josie noticed how hoarse her voice was and how each breath seemed like a great effort. Her skin was gray, and her chest rose and fell rapidly with the shallow breaths that were all she could manage. "It was no trouble," Josie replied. "And thank you for being here as well," Catherine muttered. "Between the two of you, you have shown me more kindness in these last few days than I have seen for a long time." She gave Josie a more direct look. "Your ma only wants the best for you, you know. What we talked about yesterday, don't give up. Mistletoe Lodge is a lovely boarding house, and I'm sure your parents are very proud of the business. But they would want you to be happy too." Josie felt the color rising in her cheeks, knowing that Catherine was trying to tell her not to give up on the thought of love and finding a husband of her own. She nodded briefly, thinking again how kind-hearted Catherine was to be thinking of others as her own life was ebbing away. "Don't talk too much," she murmured. "Save your energy." It broke Josie's heart that life had been so unkind to a girl who didn't deserve it. She could only hope that the next world, in the arms of the Lord, would give her the peace and joy that she deserved. She saw Catherine look up at the simple wooden cross that hung next to the bed and knew that faith in God was giving her the courage to accept her fate. "It's fine. I want to speak these last few words to you both," Catherine said slowly. She turned her head to look at Reuben and gave him a soft smile. "Your letters have given me so much happiness, Reuben. You are a kind, hard-working man, I can tell. Don't give up on your dreams for Shadow Ranch. I pray that your efforts will pay off." Her voice was becoming weaker, and Reuben had to lean closer to hear what she was saying. "Maybe, one day, when the sun is shining and the breeze is blowing across your land, you might remember me with fondness. I wish I had been able to see the ranch, but it's not to be. It would make me happy to know that you think of me, sometimes." Josie blinked back her tears at Catherine's suggestion and saw Reuben nod. "I'll always remember you, Catherine. God bless you." His voice was thick with emotion, and he held Josie's gaze for a moment as they each thought about the messages she had wanted to leave them with. The hours started to blend into each other as the afternoon matured. The light in the room was growing dim, and Josie realized that she'd spent practically half of the day with Catherine and Reuben, although time had ceased to matter. There was little conversation other than Josie checking that Catherine was comfortable, or the occasional whispered thoughts that occurred to Catherine. Her train of thought was becoming confused, and the things she mentioned were like snatched memories of people and places from her past. Josie and Reuben both held one of Catherine's hands each. Her skin was dry and her limbs felt heavy, but they wanted her to have that sense of human connection until the very end. Night had fallen by the time it happened, and they didn't even notice at first. Catherine had been sleeping peacefully for several hours as though her body was finally surrendering. Her breath grew quieter, and it was only as a new sense of silence settled over the room that Josie realized her chest had finally stilled. Catherine had simply slipped away with no struggle, and for that, Josie was grateful. "She's gone," Josie whispered. She didn't want to be the one to break the moment, but she felt almost obliged to. Reuben had been sitting with his head bowed for many hours, as though he were in prayer. "I know. Farewell, my dear," he said quietly. Josie carefully let go of Catherine's hand and stood up, wanting to give him some privacy for the moment. "I'll go and tell my parents, and I'll make you a cup of coffee if you'd like. I really am so sorry, Reuben." As she edged out of the bedroom, she wondered whether he had even heard her. Reuben was still sitting next to the bed, not saying a word, as he stared down at Catherine, who looked as though she was simply sleeping. His face was etched with grief and regret. But Josie knew that this was only the start of him having to let go of his dreams of marriage and making a happy life with the young woman who he had known for such a brief but precious time. Downstairs, Josie found Louise, who was busy setting the table in the dining room. She stared at her for a moment before shaking her head to indicate what had happened. "Poor Catherine! And Reuben, too. What a terrible thing to happen," Louise whispered. "I wish there was something more we could have done," Josie said. "Is he still up there with her?" Josie could only manage a nod in response. She assumed that her mother had sent all the other girls to their rooms as the communal areas of the boarding house were deserted. Josie was thankful for that. She didn't want the others to witness such a moment. "I'll ask your pa to call for Pastor Franklin so arrangements can be made for the funeral," Louise replied, turning to practical matters to help them cope. "I'm going to make him a cup of coffee," Josie muttered. "I think he's in shock." She hurried away to the kitchen, where Edith gave her a hug and reassured her that they had done everything they could to make Catherine's end as comfortable as they could. She had just finished pouring the coffee into a cup when she heard the thump of heavy footsteps in the hallway as Reuben rushed past the kitchen and out the front door. Josie grabbed the coffee and hurried after him. He was in no fit state to ride all the way home after such a distressing day, especially since it was now dark. "Reuben," she called to him, causing him to stop in his tracks. "Here, I made a cup of coffee for you." "Thanks," he muttered as he turned around and approached her. He took his hat off and raked his hand through his hair, looking distracted. "She only spoke about you with love," Josie said comfortingly as she handed him the drink. She could see the pain in his eyes and how difficult he was finding it to look at her. "Are you really going to leave now? You're welcome to stay for longer if you would like. I'm sure Ma and Pa would be happy for you to spend the night here. Pa's going to fetch the pastor now, so you don't have to worry about that." "I have to get back to my ranch," he muttered, his voice wooden and empty. "There are animals to feed and all the chores still to do." He looked down at the coffee as though surprised to see it in his hand and took a gulp. The kick of the dark brew seemed to snap him out of his pain for a moment, and he pulled a face. "It's funny, isn't it? You think you have life all planned out, and then something completely different happens. I guess I'm destined to be a bachelor after all, no matter what Wallace says." Josie knew it would have been insensitive to tell him that things might change in the future. She could only watch as he drained the last mouthfuls of coffee and handed the cup back. He gave her a frank look as they walked toward his horse. "Catherine told me that you sat with her all the time, other than when you rode out to fetch me. She was very appreciative of what you did, and I am too. Some folks would have shied away from seeing a person's life slipping away, but you didn't. I owe you a debt of gratitude, Miss Watkins." His voice cracked, and he took a moment to gather himself. "It was a kind thing to do, so thank you. It makes me feel better to know that she wasn't alone once she got here." "I'm just glad that I could help in some small way," Josie said, feeling suddenly shy. She didn't deserve so much praise for just doing what the Lord would have wanted. She looked out into the dark night and changed the subject. "Are you really sure it's a good idea to ride while it is so dark out?" "I'll be fine," Reuben said. He tightened the cinch on his horse and swung himself up into the saddle. "Well, the offer still stands if you change your mind," Josie said. "I understand that it's an upsetting time for you." "It must be God's will," Reuben said quietly, as though only just realizing. "Catherine would not have died so soon if it were not," he continued, finally locking his gaze with hers. "Thank you for the offer and for your family's kindness, but I must get back to my ranch now." He tipped his hat to her and then picked up the reins. "It must be God's will for me to live alone too," he muttered, almost to himself. "We must all follow the Lord's wishes," he added as the horse trotted away. Josie stood for a moment, watching Reuben until the darkness had swallowed them both up. The events of the last couple of days were still hard to believe, and her heart ached with sadness for him and the loneliness she had heard in his voice. "I pray that the Lord will help you find happiness one day," she whispered. Overhead, an owl hooted, and Josie turned to go back inside. Chapter 7. A cold wind whipped the sheets as Josie hung them on the washing line outside. It was a dry day, so it was still worth pegging the washing out, even though she could sense the weather changing and winter was almost upon them. It felt good to be outside in the bracing fresh air, and it helped Josie to clear her mind from the tumultuous thoughts which seemed to engulf her all too easily lately. Catherine's funeral had been the last time she'd seen Reuben. He had attended along with the girls in the boarding house, although none of them had known Catherine. Josie thought it kind that Mr. Fritz, the stagecoach driver, had also made an appearance, because, without him, there would have been no time to fetch Reuben to be with Catherine in the first place. In the weeks that followed, Josie had found it hard to get back to her usual routine of work and welcoming their guests. Although she had only known the girl for 2 days, Catherine's death had more of an effect on her than she could have ever imagined. Don't give up on finding love. Catherine's words of encouragement still rang in her ears, but they felt hollow and meaningless. New young ladies were arriving every week, and they had never been so busy at Mistletoe Lodge. There was barely time to read a book, let alone wonder about meeting a suitable husband. Josie sighed and shook her head slightly as her thoughts turned to romance again. The truth was, she didn't want to think about courting any of the men in Rocky River because there was only one person she could think of, Reuben Harris. His dark eyes would appear in her dreams, and she imagined running her fingers through his thick hair. She knew it was wrong, especially when the woman he was supposed to marry had become a friend of hers in her last days. But no matter how much she busied herself with work or talked to the women staying at the boarding house to distract herself, as soon as she was alone again, her thoughts turned back to Reuben, as if she had no control over them. Lord, please help me clear my mind. Give me something else to think about. She prayed that she would be able to blank him out. But nothing seemed to work, and in the next breath, she would be praying that Reuben wasn't feeling too broken by losing Catherine. She had never known such confusion. Louise's eyes narrowed as she stood at the window in Barton's study, watching Josie outside by the washing line. She had finished pegging the sheets out, and now she seemed to be just gazing blankly at the distant hills. This wasn't the first time she had noticed a change in Josie's behavior since Catherine's sad demise. Barton told her she was worrying about nothing, but Louise knew that her maternal instinct was right to be concerned. Josie had picked at her food the last few nights, and her usual sunny demeanor had all but vanished. What worried her most was the sad expression that crept over Josie's face when she was listening to the guests talking excitedly about their upcoming weddings. She used to join in, eager to suggest doing their hair for them and what they might enjoy about living in Rocky River. But now her replies were quiet and brief. "Do you think it's time that we find a husband for Josie?" Louise asked her husband as she turned back from the window. "She's been so quiet lately. It would perhaps be good for her to have something to take her mind off all of this sadness." Barton looked up from the ledger he was writing in at his desk. "You want to find someone for her instead of letting her start courting of her own accord?" Louise flinched at the way Barton asked the question. She'd known it was coming, but she winced at the thought of having to justify herself. "It's just that she's so young and innocent. I know that's partly our fault for keeping her so busy at work, but what if she chooses the wrong person to marry? We can at least have a say in it so that we find her a suitable match." "I suppose it's something to think about," Barton replied. He sat back in his chair and gave Louise a fond smile. His heart still lifted with love when he looked at her long brown hair that now had threads of silver running through it, and the dear face that was so familiar to him. "Remember that we married for love, Louise. Don't you think it was the best thing we ever did?" "I certainly do," Louise chuckled. She knew her husband well enough to anticipate that he would use that fact as his counter-argument, and she had prepared herself. "I know, Barton, but things were different back then. We grew up knowing each other already. Do you remember I practically lived with your family when my ma got sick? We were friends first, and then the Lord gradually showed us that our friendship was, in fact, love. Think about how much more innocent Josie is. I know she thinks she knows about matters of the heart. I mean, it's all our guests seem to talk about. But you know as well as I do that not all the mail-order brides end up in marriages as happy as ours. Some of them even end up as little more than unpaid labor, treated with contempt. We don't want Josie to make that sort of mistake, do we?" Barton gave her a begrudging nod. It was a strange reversal of roles that he was a romantic at heart and believed that true love would always find a way to flourish, whereas Louise was more practical. She liked to prepare for the worst, but hope for the best, and if she could stack the odds in their favor, she would happily apply herself to whatever she could do to make it happen. That was why they worked so well together as a couple. But Josie is our little girl, Louise. He stood up and strolled over to the window, becoming misty-eyed as he watched her out by the washing line. He and Louise had been married for almost 10 years before they had Josie. At one point, they had resigned themselves to the fact that they might never have children, so when Josie was born, it had felt like an unimaginable blessing. I want her to be as happy as we are. And I do as well, Louise replied briskly. She's 22 now, Barton. It's time for her to start courting, but we both know I was much more prepared for the world at her age than she is. We have to be careful with who she ends up with. Who do you have in mind? Barton still found it hard to imagine his dear daughter living anywhere other than safely under his roof. Louise hesitated for a moment. She hadn't thought too much about which of the town's bachelors would compliment her daughter, but now that Barton asked, there was one name that came immediately to mind. How about Gilbert Fry? He's well respected and an acquaintance of ours, plus he owns one of the town's best hotels. Wouldn't that be a benefit to our business? Louise offered. To her, it sounded like the perfect match. And a benefit to our daughter's happiness? She faltered and tried to imagine the match. Gilbert was well over 30, but surely that meant that he would be more reliable than a younger man, she told herself. He seems like a kind gentleman, and we have seen him at church many times. I've even seen them talking after church once or twice. I imagine they would make a pleasant couple. Louise watched as her husband started to nod slowly. She was slightly shocked that he was agreeing with her so soon, but she knew better than to question it. I suppose it could be a good match, Barton said finally. Folks in town speak highly of Gilbert, and he has plenty of money, so she would have financial security. Having worked so hard to make Mistletoe Lodge what it was, Barton didn't need to add that a partnership between the two businesses through marriage could only be a good thing. He justified a small sense of misgiving by reminding himself that Josie already knew what life was like looking after guests. She would fit in perfectly with Gilbert's lifestyle, which would make him appreciate just what a good catch Josie was as a wife. Louise nodded along with what he was saying, since he was finally seeing things from her perspective. Well then, it's settled. Why don't you talk with Gilbert, and I'll talk with Josie. I think it would be a fine match, and it would be the perfect way to stop her from going down the wrong path and finding a husband. Barton brightened and put his arm around Louise's waist. What would I do without you, my dear? You think of everything. Maybe we could plan for a spring wedding, Louise suggested. She rested her head against Barton's chest and sighed happily as she imagined the patter of little feet and their grandchildren in the future. Now, all she had to do was convince Josie that Gilbert was the perfect husband for her. Josie stood in the kitchen, cleaning the cutlery before it would be time to lay them out for dinner. She was so engrossed in the action of cleaning the forks and trying not to think about Reuben that she didn't even notice that Louise had walked into the room, and her sudden presence startled her. "Ah, there you are," Louise said. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." She patted Josie's arm, noticing that she looked pale and drawn, which made her all the more determined to act as quickly as possible on her plan. "It's all right, Ma," Josie said quietly. "Don't worry, I've almost finished." "You're doing a fine job," Louise replied. "Your pa and I have been talking, and we have some news that I think you're going to like." "What is it?" Josie asked. Her curiosity was piqued, and she put the cloth down to give Louise her full attention. "We think it's time for you to start courting." Louise watched Josie's reaction closely, and she saw hope flare in her daughter's eyes. As she had suspected, Josie had been feeling lonely and was eager to get married. "Don't you agree?" Josie nodded as an image of Reuben's rugged expression floated into her mind. "I can't say I've given it much thought, Ma. We're so busy with work, but if that's what you think." Louise smiled. This was going better than she thought it would. "The best news is that I have found the perfect match for you. It's someone you already know, which will be a great help, I believe." Josie's heart jumped. Had her thoughts about Reuben been that obvious? Now that some time had passed since Catherine's funeral, perhaps it would be acceptable for them to become reacquainted. Thank you, Ma. I didn't think you'd noticed, but I have been feeling lonesome. It's someone close to the family who your father and I think will make a perfect match. Josie's curiosity quickly gave way to confusion. She wouldn't have said that Reuben fitted that description. Suddenly, she had the horrifying thought that her ma must mean someone else. Are you sure? I haven't voiced the need for a husband. Josie stumbled over her words. I don't want to be married just yet. At least, I don't want it arranged for me. You haven't even heard who it is yet, Louise tried to reason with her. So who is it? Who have you lined up for me to marry without asking me first? Josie knew her words sounded ungrateful, but she couldn't help it. A surprising number of marriages were arranged in this way, but her heart was yearning for Reuben. He's a good friend of the family, someone who we believe will treat you well, Louise continued. It's Gilbert Fry, you know, who has visited us on a few occasions and is always pleasant company when he does. Josie couldn't stop her mouth from opening in shock. She hadn't anticipated that her mother would ever do such a thing to her, and it completely baffled her that such arrangements would have been made without her consent. Gilbert Fry? Josie said his name, recoiling at the thought of it. But he's at least 15 years older than I am. I'm younger than your father, and that has never been something that has affected our relationship, Louise reasoned. But you married Pa for love. That is entirely different from what you are suggesting I should be put through, Josie cried. She didn't usually stand her ground on things, but this was something that she wasn't going to compromise on. This was her happiness that was at stake, and she wasn't going to let that be something that was snatched away from her. Gilbert has always been supportive of our business, and I'm sure that will continue when the two of you are courting. Josie continued to shake her head. Ma, please don't do this. Whenever I've spoken to him at church, I have only ever found him pompous and dull. He's not the sort of man I could give my heart to. She felt tears filling her eyes and dashed them away in frustration. I could never love him, Ma. I just couldn't. Besides, The protestation died in Josie's mouth as she realized that it was only in her dreams that she and Reuben had any real connection. Just think about it, Josie. At least give Gilbert a chance. You might just surprise yourself. We think you'd be well matched. Josie felt disappointment curdling in her stomach, but she was determined not to give in. She had always done her best to please her parents, but she couldn't think of anything worse than spending the rest of her life with a man like Gilbert Fry. She wanted to argue that this wasn't their decision to make, but she knew that wasn't even correct. Her parents were well within their rights to do so, and that made it even worse. What if my heart belongs to someone else? Josie cried, feeling wretched and trapped. How is that even possible? Louise asked, looking puzzled. You don't know any suitable gentleman. She shook her head as Josie ran from the room. Her usually compliant daughter had displayed a hot-headed streak that wasn't like her at all, and she didn't want her to ruin her chances with Mr. Fry with an outburst like that again. Chapter 8. After everything that he had been through in recent weeks, Reuben was finding it hard to retain his enthusiasm for Shadow Ranch. As he trudged across the paddock, picking up rocks and putting them on a cart to take back to the homestead, he barely noticed the views which used to give him so much pleasure. He could do with an extra pair of hands to help him, but the idea of being able to afford a ranch hand felt further away than ever. What if it was a terrible mistake coming out west? Maybe losing Catherine was the Lord's way of telling me it's time to move on, put my dreams behind me, and try something different. Reuben had only the animals around him for company as he worked, which meant his thoughts could wander at will. Except, he didn't like the direction they had been taking him in lately. He'd been so ready to be a husband. He'd been ready to open his heart up to the notion of loving a woman. But fate had other ideas, and somehow that loss had started to make him doubt everything. Wallace had called over often, under the pretext of borrowing a tool or stopping for a cup of coffee on his way past. But Reuben knew it was to stop him from dwelling on Catherine's death. The old man's intentions were kind, but he was trying his best not to rely on Wallace too much. "There's nothing wrong with talking about things," Wallace had muttered the last time he called. "When I lost my wife, folks didn't know what to say, so they never mentioned her. It made it worse, as though she hadn't existed, if you know what I mean." Reuben thought about that comment as he unloaded the rocks back by the barn. He planned to use them to make an edge around the vegetable patch, but now that he didn't have a wife to make the garden nice for, he wondered if it was a waste of time. But there was a stubborn streak in him. He'd shared the idea in one of his letters to Catherine, and she thought it sounded ideal. So he was determined to do it, even if it was just him who would see the benefit. What he hadn't dared admit to Wallace, or even to himself yet, was that he couldn't see Catherine in the same way Wallace had seen his late wife. In some ways, it was understandable, as Wallace had been married for over 30 years. Instead, other thoughts plagued his mind and twisted in his gut because he knew that they weren't the right thoughts to be having in the wake of everything. Reuben considered what people would say if they knew who he was thinking about. He'd been ready to love Catherine, but the harsh facts were that now he had to say goodbye to that notion. But, when he'd least expected it, as the initial shock of Catherine's death receded, in her place, there was someone else who just refused to leave his head. Josie had been so kind and sensitive about the situation. She had a quiet beauty about her, one that didn't demand attention, but warranted it nonetheless. Every time Reuben closed his eyes, he could see her gleaming brown hair, the smattering of freckles across her cheeks, and the way her eyes were full of warmth, wanting to do her best for the people around her. Even now, as he dragged the boulders off the cart and dropped them on the ground, hoping the hard physical labor would keep him focused, he couldn't put her out of his mind. "Stop, just stop," he groaned as guilt washed through him. He shook his head as though that would be enough to stop the thoughts. But a moment later, as he noticed a late flower still in bloom, it was Josie who was still there in his mind. It was her who he imagined himself picking it for. And the very thought of it made him feel sick with guilt. An hour later, Reuben heard the sound of Wallace on his horse trotting up the track. One of his new young colts needed training, and Reuben wanted to learn a few tips from Wallace, who had offered to help out. "Howdy, Reuben. I figured we may as well get started today." Wallace gave him a direct look as he dismounted slowly from his horse. "I'm not interrupting you doing anything important, am I? You looked deep in thought there as I was riding up." "Nothing that matters," Reuben said, standing up. "Shall we have a cup of coffee before starting?" I left a pot on the stove. Wallace followed him up onto the modest veranda and took his gloves off before lowering himself into one of the two chairs. "How are you feeling now that the weeks are passing?" Reuben poured 2 mugs of the thick, pungent black coffee and passed one to his friend. He didn't trust himself to talk about it, but knew that Wallace would prize it out of him eventually for his own good. Just trying to keep moving," Reuben said, shrugging his shoulders. "Keeping busy on the ranch helps, but sometimes I wonder what the point of it all is. I'm fine. It's just a touch of the winter blues, that's all." He forced himself to smile. "Really?" Wallace asked, clearly not buying his excuse for one moment. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not really." "It might help you, son," Wallace offered. "I may not be the best with these things, but when you've lived as long as me, I've seen some things in my time. Maybe some of them might even be useful," he added dryly. "It's a wrench to lose something you had your heart set on. Don't underestimate it." "Thank you, Wallace. I'm just trying to take things one day at a time. I was so ready to marry her. I thought I was going to be able to love her, and now she's just gone." Wallace nodded his head slowly, giving him an understanding smile. "I'm so sorry, Reuben," Wallace murmured. "I really am. The Lord works in strange ways, and sometimes the path ahead isn't clear, but we have to accept it and find a way to move on." Reuben tried to take comfort in the old man's words, but it was more the guilt that he was feeling that plagued him. Thinking about Josie when he should be mourning Catherine felt wrong and went against everything he believed about himself. He was a loyal person, so why was his mind playing these sorts of tricks on him? "I just don't know what to do with myself now," Reuben admitted. "I know how excited you were about this, but it just clearly wasn't meant to be." Wallace said. Reuben could hear the tenderness that wasn't usually in his voice, and it made him feel grateful yet again for the old man's compassion. He didn't know how he would have gotten through everything without his steady friendship. "I'll be fine," Reuben said, drinking his coffee. "As you said, we just have to persevere." He stood up, keen to get back to work. "You don't have to pretend around me, Reuben. I can see that this has hit you hard. It's just that things aren't straightforward. In fact, it's downright confusing," Reuben admitted with a rueful look. "Grief can come in many forms, but I promise things will get easier, and hard work helps keep your mind off it. That's what I found. The thing is, I've been having thoughts, but not about Catherine," Reuben said. He looked shamefaced as he spoke, expecting to see disgust in Wallace's eyes. But instead, Wallace cocked his head to the side, clearly interested in what Reuben had to say. "When Catherine was sick, the girl looking after her, well, she is who I've been thinking about. Josie Watkins is her name. She's the daughter of the family that owns Mistletoe Lodge. She was so kind and caring to Catherine and to me. It was such a strange, difficult time, but she made everything feel a little easier, if you know what I mean." He twisted the mug in his hands, trying to pick his way through his muddled thoughts and feelings. "It doesn't make sense. We only spent those few hours together as Catherine was slipping away, but I find myself thinking about Josie, wondering how she is. I feel so guilty for doing so when I should be focusing on Catherine and losing her. No, I think you are well within your rights to think about her if she is as kind-hearted as you say." Wallace's words caught him off guard. Reuben had been preparing to hear that what he was doing was completely wrong and showed him to be a cruel, uncaring person. "What do you mean?" Reuben asked, blinking rapidly. He wondered if Wallace had really been paying attention to what he'd said. Wallace put his empty mug down and leaned forward. "You only ever spoke to Catherine through letters, didn't you? I mean, other than spending those last few hours by her bedside." Reuben nodded, feeling guilty all over again. He should have done more, although he didn't know what it could have been. "I know you wrote regularly, but you didn't really know her that well, did you? It's after marriage that you would have gotten to know each other better, but you never had that chance. You were in love with the idea of marrying her, and now perhaps you're feeling guilty that you should be grieving more. But we can't grieve what we don't know, son. We can feel sorrow for what might have been, but you shouldn't let it keep you stuck in the past." Reuben thought about Wallace's reasoning for a moment. He wasn't wrong that he hadn't known much about Catherine, only what she had disclosed in the letters. It didn't ease his conscience much, but Reuben was grateful that the old man was trying to be supportive. "There was just something about Josie. I feel awful for saying it. She came to get me to let me know that Catherine was dying and showed me kindness beyond what anyone would have expected. But to be thinking of her so soon after losing Catherine, what kind of man does that make me?" "It makes you human, just like the rest of us, son," Wallace said without hesitation. "Don't go worrying about things that you can't control. If you've fallen for this girl, then that is your heart telling you that it's the right thing. Maybe it was the Lord's will that Catherine's death should have made your path cross with Josie's. Did you think about it that way?" Reuben pondered over Wallace's words for a moment. He had considered the same thing once or twice over the last few weeks, but he quickly dismissed it, telling himself that he was just trying to justify something which was plain wrong. But now that Wallace had said it too, he wondered whether the old man was right, and that it was meant to be after all. "It just feels as though it's too soon," Reuben groaned. "Poor Catherine, she had everything to look forward to." "You're a good man, Reuben. You have a big heart," Wallace said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "From what you've told me about Catherine, I don't think she would have wanted to see you this unhappy. I don't know about that. I just feel like I have a guilty conscience right now." Reuben admitted, "Try to see past that. If you think this young woman, Josie, could be the one, don't let anything stop you from pursuing it. Trust me, son, when you're my age, the last thing you want to do is look back on your life with regrets. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Reuben nodded, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He could finally admit to himself that he wanted to get to know Josie better, but he was struggling to see how that would be possible when she was all the way back in Rocky River, and he was out working on the ranch. "You'll find a way to see her again," Wallace said as though reading his mind. He levered himself up out of the chair and slapped Reuben on his shoulder. "Shall we get on with this colt, then? He ain't going to train himself." Chapter 9. "I'll see you again next week," Gilbert Fry said, pulling his coat on. "That was a very pleasant hour in your company, Josie, but I'm not sure you should be spending so much time with the young women who stay in the boarding house." Josie paused from putting the teacups back on the tray. "That's the part of this job that I most enjoy," she replied. "Why? What's wrong with helping them settle into life in Rocky River?" She couldn't help but be curious. Gilbert Fry sure seemed to have a lot of rules and opinions about Mistletoe Lodge, and it made her bristle slightly, as though he thought her parents weren't running the business right. "They stay with you for such a short while, my dear. You wouldn't understand, but in my experience running the Grandee Hotel for many years, it's always better to maintain a dignified distance between yourself and the guests. But Ma and Pa have always prided themselves on the little touches that make our guests feel at home. Oftentimes they're nervous about their wedding, so I like to take their minds off it." Gilbert patted her on the arm. "A quaint notion, but doubtless it's a complete waste of time." He sniffed slightly as he looked around the parlor, his gaze lingering on the worn but comfortable horsehair sofas and the jumble of books on the table for their guests to read if they were that way inclined. "Just think, if you weren't fussing over the guests, you'd have more time to smarten the place up a bit. I'm surprised Barton doesn't see that, but he always did have rather a romanticized idea of running a business. That's why Mistletoe Lodge will always remain rather." He searched for the right words. "Rather small and cheap." "Well, we like it just fine," Josie retorted, unable to help herself. "And so do our guests. They always say they've enjoyed staying here." She heard the creak of floorboards outside the parlor door and knew that it was probably her ma, making sure that the meeting was going well. She had promised her parents that she would sit and take tea with Gilbert to at least give their idea a try. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized he was pompous and self-absorbed. She pressed her lips together so she wouldn't say more, even though she longed to tell Mr. Fry that he should never come back. "Well, I'm sure they do," Gilbert continued, blithely unaware that Josie had taken offense. "But that's because Mistletoe Lodge attracts a lower class of women to stay. They're probably grateful for cheap lodgings and whatever food that old cook of yours gives them before they embark on a marriage to some of the less choosy men out west." He beamed at Josie. "Don't worry. Once you come to live at the Grandee, you'll see what I mean. You'll find it eye-opening, I'm sure, seeing how a proper business is run." "Goodness, is that snow I see starting to fall? You'd better be on your way, Mr. Fry." Josie lifted her chin and stalked out of the parlor, almost knocking Louise over, where she had been loitering outside. "See you again next week," Gilbert said, sauntering after her. He raised his hat and gave Louise a charming smile. "She's certainly opinionated, your daughter, but I don't mind a high-spirited woman as long as she knows her place once we're married." At breakfast the following day, Josie caught her father stealing nervous glances in her direction multiple times. His face was a picture of concern, as though he was waiting for her to push back again on the decision they had made. Josie knew that her father had a soft spot for her, but whether or not that meant he was willing to listen to her wasn't something she could say with confidence. Since the announcement that she would be marrying Gilbert, Josie couldn't help but feel a newfound jealousy of their guests. They had at least had the choice of who they responded to in their letters as mail-order brides, but it felt as though she had been robbed of that luxury by her parents. She picked at her bowl of porridge with no appetite. "It's early days getting to know Mr. Fry," Barton ventured, giving her an encouraging smile. "You need to give the poor man a chance," Louise chimed in. "It sounded as though you were being rather short with him when he was leaving last night." "You didn't hear what he said about Mistletoe Lodge." Josie frowned, remembering the dismissive way he had spoken about her pa. She remembered how nicely Reuben had spoken about the business. Reuben would never be that rude. He said the boarding house was homely and that Ma and Pa had been very kind to him. The thought made her even more miserable. She pushed herself up from the table and turned to leave with a dejected look on her face. I'm going to start cleaning the bedrooms. If we get a snowstorm, we might have guests arriving unexpectedly. Barton sighed and shook his head as the door closed behind his daughter. Are you sure we're doing the right thing, Louise? He asked quietly. It's early days. I never expected them to fall in love instantly, but we need to encourage him to keep coming over. Otherwise, he might look elsewhere. Louise sipped her cup of tea, but her expression was troubled. Josie is clearly not happy about it. Maybe Gilbert isn't the man for her. But in principle, they're so well suited, Louise muttered. Although I did overhear him questioning the way we run the business. Josie jumped to our defense. Of course she did, Barton said. He reached across the table and took Louise's hand in his. I think we are potentially robbing her of happiness, and I'm worried that she may try to take matters into her own hands. Louise frowned at his statement, but Barton felt the need to speak his mind. Into her own hands? Louise, what happens if she runs away? You must be able to see that Josie doesn't want this. I'm worried that she might leave rather than go through with this. He glanced toward the dining room, where all their guests were enjoying eggs and bacon. She's spent years seeing young ladies travel across the country to take a chance on marriage with someone they've only written to. What if she decides to do the same thing? We might never see her again, and I don't think I could bear that. It pained him to have to worry about his daughter in such a way. She won't run away if she knows what's good for her. Louise brushed off his comment calmly, although his words had sent a shiver of worry through her. Barton, dear, I'm not going back on the decision because Mr. Fry hasn't even started properly courting her yet. He's only visited for tea a handful of times. I'm sure that she will see sense eventually. I'm not talking about going back on our decision, but perhaps she needs a bit of time to think about things. What do you have in mind? Well, perhaps we should give her a day off. Ever since the death of poor Catherine, she has been working so hard without taking a moment to heal. Maybe we asked too much of her to sit with a dying woman? Louise was quick to agree. Despite what Barton thought, she did want the best for Josie, and she could tell their daughter had a lot on her mind. I think that sounds reasonable. If she gets on with her chores today, she could take tomorrow off. It might give her a chance to think about what a good option marrying Gilbert is. Barton still felt rather uneasy about the whole thing, but this felt like a small kindness that Josie could be afforded. I'll let her know and ask Edith to pack her some lunch. That way, she can spend all day tomorrow doing whatever she wants, Louise said as she rose from her seat. Knowing her, it will involve riding out somewhere on dawn, but as long as the weather holds fair, it might do her some good before we get busy for the festive period. Reuben's heart sank when he saw the telltale tracks in the snow on his early morning walk around the paddocks behind the barn. There was no mistaking their distinctive shape, and he knew what it meant in an instant. A cougar had been nearby. The fact that it had been bold enough to come close to the homestead showed it was hungry, which meant trouble. He briefly considered riding over to rouse Wallace to see if he would help him deal with it. But it was early, and he didn't want his neighbor to feel as though he had to help with everything. Reuben had to learn to stand on his own 2 feet if he was to make a go of Shadow Ranch. After hastily finishing feeding the animals in the barn and checking that the doors were securely closed behind him, he grabbed his rifle and set out to follow the tracks. He didn't have enough room to bring all his cattle home for the winter yet, and some of his best animals were still in the most distant paddocks he owned. They would be exactly what the cougar would be most likely to target, and he felt his heart pumping faster at what he might find. I should have found a way to bring them home, he muttered, chastising himself. Can't afford to lose animals to a big cat. He quickened his pace, keeping his head down as he followed the tracks. There were plenty of wooded areas around his land, and he found himself praying that perhaps the cougar would have taken fright and retreated to the shelter of trees or gone higher up back into the mountains where it would most likely live. Wallace had told him that the mountain lions rarely caused trouble, but that didn't mean he could get complacent. "It's not looking good," he groaned as he crested the hill. Reuben could tell exactly where the tracks were leading, and his breath plumed in the cold air as he jogged faster toward the fence of his paddock. He'd suspected that several of the cows in this bunch were in calf, but what with being distracted by his grief and confusion after Catherine's funeral, he'd been slow to mend a gap in the fence, promising himself that he would get to it in a day or two. But now he was paying the price for the delay. "You fool. Look what's happened, because you were so distracted by your confusion about Catherine and Josie." The painful thought filled his mind as he surveyed the scene in front of him. Sure enough, one of the cows had calved the night before, and now all that remained of the newborn animal was what the cougar had left behind after eating its fill. The snow was streaked with scarlet blood, and the rest of the animals were bunched nervously in the farthest corner of the paddock, huffing in distress. Reuben was accustomed to loss and the harsh realities of nature and living so close to the wilderness, but it seemed there had been too much loss in his life recently. He felt cheated by the hunger of a wild cat. These were his animals to raise, and he had been robbed of that, but he accepted that he only had himself to blame. The problem was that the cougar would have gotten a taste for blood now. His animals were easy targets, and it was difficult to say how long it had been since the cougar had attacked. Reuben couldn't be sure if it was still around, but he couldn't take the risk of hoping that the creature had gone for good. It could return any time, picking off his best cattle one by one. He scanned the paddock methodically until he spotted more tracks. It looked as though they were headed away from his land, but he knew that he had no choice but to follow the tracks further. There was only one way he could stop the cougar from returning and killing again, and his hand tightened around his rifle as he set off with a determined expression. For the next 3 hours, Reuben thought of nothing but protecting his stock as he trudged on foot along the winding tracks and through scrubby woodland. He had allowed his distracted state to cause the senseless loss of one of his animals, which was a bitter pill to swallow. The winter sun was high in the sky, and it was slow going, but it had to be done. His eyes darted in every direction, ready to shoot if necessary, and his nerves were stretched to breaking point as every rustle or snapping twig made him spin around to see if it was there. The dappled shade of the trees meant that the cougar could melt into the background, which only made his job harder, but he was willing to do whatever it took to protect his precious animals. The track led him through a thick belt of woodland, and he started to feel more vulnerable between the trunks of the trees, his thoughts beginning to wonder if a cougar would be able to lurk within the branches above his head. He took comfort in the fact that the tracks continued on the ground in front of him, though he was ready to run at any given moment if they suddenly vanished. Finally, the forest thinned out, the trees giving way to one of the most spectacular views he had ever seen. He had only come to this part of the mountain once since taking on Shadow Ranch, and he had forgotten how high up he was compared to the land around him. The trees gave way to open land toward the ridge of the mountain, and in front of him there was a steep canyon carved into the rocks. Reuben shaded his eyes from the low winter sun as he eyed the track ahead that descended precariously on the steep ledge to where he knew there was a waterfall. The cougar tracks appeared to lead right the way down to the waterfall, and he wondered if it had come there to drink and sleep off the big feed. Something in his gut told him that he wouldn't have to go much further to see the creature. He shifted the rifle, holding it tighter so he was ready to shoot, and crept forward. Suddenly, he caught sight of it. The sly cat was lurking on a rocky outcrop, completely still other than the faintest twitch of its tail. After a moment, it slunk slowly to the edge of the rock on its belly, and Reuben watched as it eyed something below. He guessed that it was to be the cougar's next prey, and the way the creature's muscles bunched as it prepared to leap down and attack proved his guess to be correct. He raised his rifle, wondering what poor animal was about to be attacked, and crept closer. But suddenly, with horrifying clarity, he realized it wasn't an animal, it was a person. "Josie, look out!" His shout echoed around the canyon. But it was lost in the thunder of the waterfall tumbling next to where she was sitting. The winter sun made the snow-covered trees sparkle, and the roar of the water brought Josie some brief comfort as she sat alone with her thoughts next to the waterfall. Her parents were concerned. She knew this because they wouldn't have given her the day off otherwise. "Be careful, and don't go too far," Louise had said as Edith handed her the picnic lunch earlier that day. "Perhaps a day away from the boarding house will give you some time to clear your head after Catherine's funeral. And you can think about the future." Josie opted just to let her mare decide by giving her her head, and before long, Dawn was carrying her along the track she had last taken when she'd rushed to fetch Reuben from Shadow Ranch. "You remembered, did you, Dawn?" For a moment, Josie had considered going to see Reuben on his ranch, but even though every part of her was yearning to see him again, the idea felt far too bold. She wasn't even sure what she would have said to him when she got there. Instead, she decided to visit a spot where she knew she wouldn't be disturbed. The falls were hidden away through a dense forest, and she had never seen anyone else there before. It was the perfect place to hitch the mare and for her to sit and be alone with her thoughts. As she let her mind wander over everything which had happened lately, she couldn't help but imagine Catherine's disapproval. Guilt gripped her like a steel vice, and Josie grimaced as she tried to rationalize the fact that she couldn't stop thinking about Reuben, even though fate seemed to be conspiring to push her into a marriage with Gilbert Fry. She shuddered as an image of Gilbert's cold eyes and sour expression came to mind. Josie had hoped her parents would see how miserable the courtship was making her and call it off, but she'd simply earned a day away from work instead. "I can't spend my life with Gilbert." Her agonized words were lost against the sound of the waterfall. Even though she was surrounded by the beauty of the Wyoming landscape, she didn't see any of it as her thoughts took her inward. Her mind was in turmoil as she thought about the sense of repugnance she felt in Gilbert's company and how he never listened to what she said or even looked at her with affection. To him, she was just a convenient stepping stone to further his business ambitions. Josie sighed and drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, allowing her mind to wander back to Reuben instead. She wondered what he was doing and whether he was hard at work on the other side of the mountain, so close to her, yet so far. She was so lost in her thoughts that she was oblivious to her surroundings. Suddenly, her solitude was brought to a shocking end as a rifle shot rang out over her head and a scream ripped from her throat. Chapter 10. Josie stared with wide, terrified eyes as the cougar's limp body fell just a few paces away from her and then tumbled onward to be swept away in the raging torrent of the waterfall. Before she had a chance to scream again, she became aware of a tall man running toward her. For a moment, she wondered if it was some sort of mirage, but as the man slowed and took his hat off, she realized that her rescuer was the very man she had been daydreaming about. "It's you," she whispered, looking up into Reuben's worried gaze. Josie still felt dazed from the loud shot and how close the cougar had gotten to her without her even being aware of the danger above her head. She started to tremble as she thought about how close she had come to being mauled. Reuben was standing stock still, his eyes fixed on hers in equal surprise. Then, all of a sudden, it was as though the spell was broken, and he sprang to action. "Are you okay?" I shouted, but you didn't hear me. I'm fine," Josie said, taking a deep breath to steady herself as he joined her on the ridge of the rock. "Thank you for saving me." Reuben flashed a smile at her, and she saw the worry replaced with relief in his dark eyes. It took everything within her power to drag her gaze away from his and look down at the drop below. The waterfall had swept away all evidence that a cougar had been there, and Josie blinked and shook her head slightly to clear her mind of how differently the situation could have ended if it hadn't been for the rancher's presence. "I've been tracking the cougar all morning because it killed one of my newborn calves," Reuben explained. I'm just glad I got here before that creature got to you. What are you doing all the way out here? Shall we come away from the edge? He added. Josie started walking back down the track she had taken up to the falls so that they could be away from the loud roar of the water. My parents gave me a day off, Josie said. An image of Gilbert Fry's sneering expression came into her mind, and the way he was already talking about their marriage as though it was inevitable. But she pushed it away. She didn't want to explain to Reuben that Gilbert practically considered them to be betrothed already, or even mention his name. I came out here to have a picnic and a little bit of peace and quiet. Reuben glanced around, his eyes narrowing slightly. On your own? Josie nodded, her cheeks flushing as she tried to find a way to explain her situation. I like being on my own. She shrugged it off. I don't often get the chance to ride Dawn out with work being so busy. She's hitched just down there. Reuben noticed the mare under the trees and nodded his head slowly, but Josie could feel a moment of awkwardness passing between them. I have a picnic lunch. Would you like to join me? I'm sure I have enough food for us both. She watched Reuben hesitate for a moment, but then he smiled warmly. It sure does feel like a long time since breakfast. And now I know the cougar's out of the way. I reckon I could spare some time. Thank you. That would be nice. Josie collected the basket from where she had left it next to her horse and led the way to a glade next to the waterfall. There was a large fallen tree, and Reuben brushed the snow off the trunk and laid his coat down, so Josie had somewhere to sit. How are things coming along at your ranch? Josie asked. She started to rummage through the basket of food she'd brought with her as she waited for his response. Thank you. Reuben grinned as she passed him a ham roll. The freshly baked bread smelled good, and his mouth watered. I have so many plans for the place. I want to grow the herd and clear more land. His eyes shone with enthusiasm as he shared his hopes for the following year. It's a slow job, but I reckon if I work hard enough, I can make something of the place. Mind you, losing that calf this morning was a setback. It's hard to grow with cougars attacking my stock. Is that why you came after it? Josie asked. His tone was light, but she could tell he was upset by the attack. Yes, I'm not letting a mountain lion get the better of me. It's a good job I did, too. Otherwise, who knows what might have happened. Josie didn't want to think about the danger she would have been in without him. If her parents found out, they would have been horrified, and it only deepened her feelings toward the rugged rancher sitting next to her. She found herself having to turn away as her cheeks flushed. Well, I'm glad you decided to come after it, Josie nodded. Thank you for saving me. Reuben's expression softened. You don't have to keep thanking me. Think of the lunch as a thank you, Josie said with a smile. Every time they caught each other's eye, her pulse quickened, and she hoped he wouldn't notice that she had lost her appetite. As per usual, Edith had outdone herself, including rolls and cake in the basket. Josie didn't mind sharing it with the man who had just saved her life. In fact, she was glad he seemed to be tucking in with relish. The cougar might have gotten to my youngest calf, but I'll mend the fences and make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. Josie was surprised at how comfortable she felt in his company. After the heightened emotions of being at Catherine's bedside together, it was a welcome relief to just enjoy the views around them. The mountains looked dramatic against the crisp blue sky, and she felt her worries start to recede as Reuben talked knowledgeably about the birds that flew overhead and what sort of winter they might expect. It was only as Josie cleared up the small picnic that Reuben opened his mouth to speak. Why were you really given a day off? Josie winced at the question, but then she couldn't help but wonder if Reuben was perhaps the only other person who could properly understand what he was going through. I haven't been able to concentrate very well since Catherine passed, Josie finally admitted. I know it probably sounds silly, but I just can't seem to move past it right now. I only knew the girl for a few days, but it seems to have had quite an effect. Reuben's eyes widened slightly. I know exactly how you feel. Those were the simple words that she had been craving so badly to hear, and he was the only person who could really understand the intensity of those hours with Catherine. But even though she could tell that he understood, Josie still couldn't reveal the full truth, because that would have meant telling him of the hopes and desires that lay deep in her heart. Is it even possible that he could feel the same way about me? The thought slid into her mind, but she pushed it away. She could never ask him because her parents wanted her to marry Gilbert. And besides, what hope did she have that Reuben could love her when he was still mourning for Catherine? I feel as though I am mourning something that never quite happened, and that makes it difficult and confusing. I should be moving on. And in some ways, I am, Reuben explained with a look of pain on his face. But then I feel guilty that Catherine's life was cut so short. Shall we walk to your ranch? I'd like to see it, Josie asked, thinking they should change the subject. If you have time? He looked up to see where the sun was, but there were still many hours of daylight left. It's not far, as the crow flies. I came the long way over the mountain, tracking the cougar, but there's a shortcut along that track if you don't mind crossing a stream. I understand the guilt that you feel. I feel it just as strongly, Reuben said, still lost in his thoughts, a few minutes later. They walked companionably side by side, and Josie couldn't help but wonder whether, in different circumstances, she and Reuben would have been able to court each other and marry. Those are my cattle over there. Josie followed Reuben's gaze and saw a small herd of sturdy animals grazing quietly on the grass under the trees where the snow was patchy. They're a nice-looking bunch with good form, she replied, with admiration in her voice. I can see where you need to mend your fences, but I guess you'll be taking them closer to the homestead after what happened today? Reuben looked at her with surprise. How are you so knowledgeable about stock and my kind of work? I used to help out on my uncle's ranch during the summers for many years, Josie answered with a shrug, as though it was of no consequence. I loved it. I used to wish that my parents would buy a ranch just out of town so we could raise cattle and horses, but as you know, their calling was to build up the boarding house instead. I suppose it's a similar amount of work, Reuben said with a chuckle. Something about Josie's yearning for ranch life struck a chord with him, and he looked at her with newfound respect. I used to help with breaking in the horses, too. I even got kicked by one of them, Josie recalled. It had been awful at the time, but Reuben's surprise was worth the retelling. They shouldn't have had a girl like you doing work like that. I didn't mind, she brushed off his concern. My uncle said I had a good way with the animals, and I used to look forward to getting out and working on the ranch. I think part of me always preferred it to the stuffy bustle of the boarding house. Here's the stream we need to cross, Reuben said. The water was rushing past them, and he gave Josie a worried look. Are you sure you want to do this? There's a good view of my ranch from the top of the hill on the other side of the stream, but maybe it's time for you to be getting back. I wouldn't want your parents to think you're staying out too long. No, they told me to take all the time I wanted. Josie had a sudden urge to see the view so that she could picture Reuben going about his work on the land he was clearly so passionate about. There was a series of boulders strewn across the stream that made perfect stepping stones, so Josie carefully jumped out onto the first one. It was more slippery than she thought it would be from a combination of snow and moss, and she felt herself starting to slip. Be careful, Reuben warned. He strode across several boulders next to her and quickly reached the far side, turning around to watch her. I'll be fine. Josie gathered up her skirts and leapt across the next few boulders, but just as she was one long stride from the other side of the stream, her leather boots skidded on the wet moss, and her arms flailed as she lost her balance. Reuben, I don't think I can make it. A gasp cut her sentence short, and she waited for the icy water to engulf her as the steam rushed up to meet her. What she wasn't expecting to feel were two strong arms moving around her body to stop her from falling. It's okay, I've got you, Reuben said calmly. He pulled her over the last section of water and onto dry land again. Josie's heart was pounding as she stared up at his brown eyes, his strong features laced with concern. She couldn't look away, and she found herself wishing she could stay in his arms forever, breathing in the scent of leather and wood smoke from his shirt and safe from all her troubles. I'm sorry, she gasped. She felt a powerful surge of conflicting emotions. Guilt for Catherine, shock that being with Reuben felt so wonderfully right, but also fear that he might not harbor the same feelings for her. Her heart beat faster as he held her gaze for a moment. Reuben was speechless as he stared down at her. He had never felt this strongly about a woman before, not even Catherine, and his emotions took him by surprise. But Josie's expression was impossible to read, and he knew that he was being selfish to wish that the moment could last forever. He wanted to marry her, that much he was sure about. He enjoyed her company and felt sure that they would be a perfect match, especially as she had demonstrated that she longed to live the sort of ranching life that didn't suit some women. But there was something about Josie's situation that held him back from declaring his feelings. She had come out for the day to be alone with her thoughts, which meant she must have something pressing that she needed to figure out. Do I have any right to add to her worries? What if she doesn't feel the same way? He longed to tell her how special she was to him and that she was on his mind all the time, but he bit the words back. A sudden rumble of thunder in the distance made Josie look away, and Reuben stepped back slightly. "You'd better get back to town," he said hastily. "The snow clouds are building, and I'd hate for you to get stuck." Josie turned and gazed up at him again, the emotions chasing across her brown eyes. Her lips were slightly parted, and Reuben wished he could take her back in his arms again. Seeing her here, on his ranch, stirred something within him, something loving. He had an urge to protect her from the world and a determination to do right by her. "Would you like me to escort you back into town?" he asked, hoping that she might say yes. "No, you've already done more than enough," Josie replied. He wondered if he detected a note of regret in her voice. I'll see you around." She turned and hurried away to get back to her horse, and Reuben felt a piece of his heart go with her. Chapter 11. "Ah, you're back. I was beginning to wonder where you'd gotten to," Wallace called from the veranda of Reuben's cabin. "Everything all right?" Reuben simply shook his head, removing his hat so that he could run a hand through his hair. While the older man's advice was usually something he appreciated, Reuben really wasn't in the mood for chatting at that moment. His mind was still churning from the encounter with Josie, and his thoughts felt as tangled as an old ball of wool. He sighed and then smiled up at him, reminding himself that Wallace was his best friend and a kind-hearted neighbor to be worried about him. "I'm fine, Wallace. I had to deal with a cougar on my land. The wretched thing mauled one of my calves," Reuben explained. "I only have myself to blame, though. I should have taken your advice and moved them closer to home last week." "Well, we all learn from our mistakes, son, and it takes guts to admit when you're in the wrong." Wallace raised his bushy eyebrow. "And that's all you've been up to? I spotted you coming back from down by the waterfall. That's a mighty long way to go for a cougar." Reuben shifted on his feet for a moment, wondering whether it might be a good idea to ask for some advice from the old man. He had been married for 30 years, after all. He probably knew a lot more about matters of the heart than he did. "When I was hunting down the cougar, I bumped into Josie. You know, the young woman I told you about from Mistletoe Lodge in town," Reuben said haltingly. He continued to tell the story of Josie's brush with danger and the picnic, feeling himself color red when he mentioned about how he had stopped her from falling into the stream. Wallace listened carefully, nodding his head occasionally as they settled into the 2 seats on the veranda. "You like this girl, huh?" he asked when Reuben eventually came to a finish. "Any reason why you can't just tell her that?" Reuben could only shrug his shoulders as he twisted his hat in his hands. "I'm not sure," he muttered. He looked down at the scuffed toes of his boots and sighed with frustration. "I know we haven't known each other for long, but I feel as though I know her better than anyone I've ever met. I suppose it must be something to do with how we shared the bond of being with Catherine. Today I realized that I want to ask her pa if I can court his daughter. Would it be crazy of me to be thinking that I'd like to marry her, Wallace? Barton would probably run me out of town. I got the impression he's pretty protective of Josie, but I can't get her out of my mind," Reuben admitted. "So why don't you do something about it?" Wallace asked. "I feel too guilty right now," Reuben said slowly. His shoulders sagged, and he shook his head. "I feel that I'd be letting Catherine down. tarnishing her memory somehow. It's far too soon for me to be thinking about marriage. Besides, I don't even know if Josie will say yes. She might be courting already, for all I know, although she hasn't mentioned anyone. I think you're worrying too much about this situation, son, Wallace said after a short pause. Take Catherine's behavior as an example. She took a chance on love, and the fact that she headed all the way out here must tell you that she had an adventurous spirit. I don't believe she would have wanted you to struggle on your own. She would have wanted you to be happy and take a chance on love as well. But Josie took care of Catherine, and they became friends, even in that short while. What would folks think to see me walking out with Catherine's only friend in Rocky River, and so soon after the funeral? Reuben continued. It just doesn't sit right with me. I thought you said that Catherine encouraged Josie to go after her dreams, Wallace said cautiously. He could see how troubled Reuben was feeling, and he didn't want to upset his friend. Uh-huh. It was near the end. She knew she didn't have long to live, and I think she was trying to tell us to make the most of our lives. Reuben wondered whether Catherine had even been aware of what she'd been saying at that point. Maybe it was her way of saying she didn't want you to be lonely forever, Wallace said softly. She would have wanted you to get back on your feet and go after these feelings that you have. And if Josie doesn't like me in the same way? Reuben felt a glimmer of hope for the first time, but it felt too fragile to trust quite yet. Then you would have at least tried, Wallace said, shooting him a smile. You will always regret it more if you don't take the chance. Believe me. He stood up and stamped his feet to get warm again. I guess it's something to think about. Reuben stood up as well. He still had to take hay out for the horses, and the sun was starting to sink in the west. They would have snow before nightfall. Don't leave it too long. I know Barton and Louise from way back, and I recall meeting Josie when she was a young girl, and now she must be a pretty woman. I wouldn't be surprised if she had other men thinking she'd make a wonderful wife. Reuben waved Wallace goodbye and then set off to complete his chores for the day. The old man was full of wisdom, and his words brought comfort to Reuben. But he still had lingering doubts. Reuben knew that he shouldn't stay shackled to the past forever, but he still wasn't sure if he deserved someone like Josie. Chapter 12. Are you going to help us decorate the tree, Josie? It's only 2 days until Christmas. Louise's cheeks were pink from the fire that crackled in the dining room hearth. The guests had all finished breakfast, so they were clearing up together. You know how much your pa loves to make the place look festive, Josie nodded, glancing out of the window. Gilbert would be arriving shortly, and she was already dreading it. That's why we decided to take on this boarding house, Louise continued brightly. She knew that Josie already knew the story, but she was trying to cheer her daughter up. Christmas is Barton's favorite time of year, and when he saw that there was an apple tree out back, covered in mistletoe, he said it was a sign that this would be the ideal place for our new business. And that's why it's called Mistletoe Lodge, Josie finished. She knew the story by heart, and usually it made her happy. But not today. Ever since the picnic with Reuben a few weeks earlier, Josie had been unable to concentrate. The worst thing was that she knew they still wanted her to marry Gilbert, and that broke her even more. Being with Reuben that day had given her a glimpse of what real love might feel like. The easy companionship between them and the way her pulse raced at his touch. She wanted to be with Reuben, which was why the thought of marrying Gilbert was making her feel even more wretched than before. Josie wished more than anything that she could be the one to decide her own future, but Gilbert seemed more determined than ever. He visited almost daily, finding the slightest excuse to drop by, even though she did nothing to encourage it. Why can't they see what Gilbert is really like? Josie was tempted to tell her parents about all the snide comments he made about Mistletoe Lodge, but so many people in Rocky River seemed to admire the man that she wasn't sure they would believe her. As she carried out her daily chores, Reuben was never far from her mind. His face appeared in every dream, and sometimes Josie was even sure that she could hear his voice in the wind. She prayed that he would come and save her from Gilbert's attentions. But why would he? Reuben had no idea how she really felt, and was busy caring for his animals. The thought that he might come galloping into Rocky River to declare that he loved her was as fanciful as it was ridiculous. She was being as wishful as a child, except Josie was old enough to know that there was no such thing as wishes coming true. "Are you going to change into a different gown before Gilbert arrives this morning?" Louise asked, breaking into Josie's daydreams. "If you think I should," Josie sighed. She drifted away and wearily climbed the stairs, and Louise watched her go with a troubled expression. Louise had whispered to Barton earlier that she had high hopes that today's visit would be Gilbert's formal marriage proposal. But as she saw how miserable Josie looked, she felt a pang of misgivings. Josie was clearly upset, but there was something else beneath it all. Lately, she had looked preoccupied. Louise wasn't sure what it was that struck her about her daughter's behavior, but it reminded her of when she had first met Barton. Back then, as love blossomed between them, she hadn't been able to think of anything but him, even when there was so much going on around her. Louise had let the thoughts guide her like a hand in the darkness, and ultimately, they had led her to a life of happiness. Now she couldn't help but wonder if Josie was being completely honest with them. Has she met someone else? Is there another man she would rather be with? The thoughts nudged at the corner of her mind, taking root. But Louise couldn't imagine who that could be. Her daughter barely left the boarding house, so it didn't feel possible that Josie would have had the opportunity to find someone else. She thought back to how Barton had glowed with pride whenever he had walked out with her all those years ago, and the way her heart had jumped in her chest when he held her hand. She hadn't noticed anything like that between Gilbert Fry and Josie. "But Gilbert is a well-respected hotel owner," she muttered to herself. "Surely he'll take care of Josie the way we'd expect a husband to behave?" Louise sighed, wishing suddenly that she had taken the time to have a proper talk with Josie to find out what was troubling her. They had been so busy with a sudden rush of new guests in the last few weeks that there simply hadn't been time. Thinking back, she realized that it had only been since Josie's day out that her daughter had seemed particularly quiet and withdrawn. Perhaps it's just nerves about getting married? Louise bustled to the front door as she heard a sharp staccato of knocks. It was Gilbert calling to take coffee with Josie. He had arrived early, which could only be a good sign. "So what do you say, Josie? I think it's time to make things official and start telling people you're my fiancé. There's no need to wait any longer." Gilbert rocked on his toes in front of the fire in the parlor, looking pleased with himself. Josie glanced at him, taking in the graying hair and the way his waistcoat stretched over his belly, feeling herself recoil. The thought of being in his embrace was unbearable, and she couldn't even contemplate the idea of bearing his children. "Shall we take a walk in the garden?" Josie murmured. She couldn't bring herself to agree with his decision that they should be married straight after Christmas. Gilbert pulled a face. He was more used to being in his office than enjoying the great outdoors. He gave her a sly look, wondering whether it was because she was feeling shy. "I suppose it couldn't harm. It stopped snowing for now." A few minutes later, Josie tightened her shawl over her shoulders and hurried outside, trying to maintain some sort of distance between them. "Did you hear what I said?" Gilbert called, striding after her. "Sorry, I was distracted," Josie replied. She stared around, looking for something to talk about. "Look, there are 2 doves in the apple tree. Don't they look sweet?" she said, desperately trying to change the subject. "I love Christmas, don't you? It's our favorite time of the year. That's why the boarding house is called Mistletoe Lodge. Pa has always had a soft spot for mistletoe, and how he and Ma fell in love, you see." Gilbert shook his head as though she was being ridiculous. "I was talking about our marriage," he continued, brushing her words aside. "It will be perfect for our 2 businesses. With my hotel and your parents' boarding house, we can create something really special. The boarding house will be yours one day, and by marriage, it will then also be mine. I have big plans for the place, Josie. I'll get rid of all the ornaments that your folks seem to favor, make it more modern, and the money will soon start rolling in." He rubbed his hands with a greedy gleam in his eyes, eyeing up the buildings as though they were already his. "That's all I am to him, just a way to get a hold of Mistletoe Lodge. Josie couldn't stop herself from frowning at the sickening realization. She took a deep breath and turned to face him. "I can't marry you, Gilbert." The words were brief but firm, and then Josie wanted to take them back as soon as she had said them. Not because they weren't true, but because she could already see the anger flare in his eyes, like a match that had been lit. "What did you just say to me?" Gilbert snatched her hand and crushed it in his own, making her wince in pain. "Did I hear you right? You're calling off our marriage?" I'm sorry," she said hastily. "I really am sorry, Gilbert. But I don't love you, and for that reason, I cannot marry you. I will not." It was perhaps the first time that she had stood up for herself in this way, and Josie could feel her heart racing with the consequences. She lifted her chin and stared at him defiantly, determined to make her point. "You can't go back on our arrangement," Gilbert spluttered. "I've already paid for the pastor to perform the ceremony. You won't be able to get out of this so easily." Josie could see his anger building. She swallowed and tried to discreetly remove her hand from his grasp, but it was impossible. He had her in a vice-like grip, and his face had turned an ugly shade of red. "Please, let me go," Josie begged him. "There's no need for this to create ill feeling. I expect there are plenty of other young ladies who would make you a better wife, Gilbert," she continued, trying to reason with him. "I just can't marry you, and that's the end of it. You don't get a choice in the matter." Gilbert snarled. "Do you think I would have invested all this time into visiting you without good reason? I've already got big plans for Mistletoe Lodge just as soon as that dottery old pa of yours retires, which I shall persuade him to do as soon as possible. You will be my wife, Josie Watkins, and woe betide if you try any more nonsense like this again." As he was speaking, his grip tightened, and suddenly he yanked her toward him. Instinctively, Josie tried to step back. She wasn't sure what he was going to do or what he was capable of, and she wasn't in the mood to find out. "Stay away from me," Josie cried. She was vaguely aware of the drumming sound of hoofbeats approaching, but her sole focus was on Gilbert as she felt terror rising in her chest. Too late, Josie realized with horror that he was going to force a kiss on her. "Get off me, Gilbert," she yelled, trying to wriggle out of his grasp. "You're talking nonsense, Josie. We're as good as married, so if I want to kiss you, I will," Gilbert persisted. He leaned closer, his hot breath on her face. "Ma help!" Josie glanced desperately toward the boarding house, willing one of her parents to come out and see the truth about the man they had chosen for her. In one final attempt to save herself, Josie used all of her strength to shove him away and send him sprawling in the snow. "You useless girl!" Gilbert roared as he scrambled back up to his feet. "Just wait until you're my wife, and you'll soon see how I deal with that kind of behavior." "You'll do no such thing, Mr. Fry. Now apologize to the lady or else." Josie gasped as she heard the low, firm voice which had filled so many of her dreams. It was Reuben, and he had vaulted off his horse and was striding toward Gilbert with his fists clenched by his side. "Who are you?" Gilbert spat contemptuously, brushing the snow from his suit as he eyed Reuben warily. "Stay out of my business, stranger. Josie's my fiancée, and I'll do as I please with her." Reuben didn't reply. Instead, he stepped forward, and there was a thud as his fist connected with Gilbert's chin, sending him flat out on the snow again. A bruise started to form immediately, and Gilbert whimpered with the pain and indignity of it. "I'm here to protect her honor," Reuben said, gesturing to Josie. "No matter whether you're engaged or not, you shouldn't be treating a woman like that." Gilbert cowered beneath him, putting his hands to his face in case any more punches might come his way. "I'm going to be her husband, so I can do what I want," Gilbert cried from the ground. "Who are you to walk in here and tell me what to do? Do you know who I am? You won't get away with this. All I know is that you're not a gentleman." "No real man would act like that," Reuben said calmly. Josie could feel her heart thumping in her chest as she watched the exchange between the two men. She had no idea what had brought Reuben to Mistletoe Lodge. She was just overwhelmed with gratitude that he had saved her from Gilbert's lecherous advances. "I've paid the pastor. We could go and get married right now if I told him to get on with it." Gilbert said sulkily as he rolled onto his knees and attempted to stand up again. Well, that sure is a shame because a beautiful, smart young woman like Josie deserves much better than a rat like you. Before either of the men could say anything more, Josie heard the front door open. What is the meaning of this? Barton demanded as he rushed down the veranda steps with Louise close behind. Reuben lowered his fisted hands and took a few steps back from Gilbert, allowing the groaning man time to stand on his own. I think I'd like to ask the same question, Gilbert snapped. Josie felt tears brimming in her eyes at the thought that her parents might still want her to be with him. I was just trying to talk to your daughter when all of a sudden she started telling me that she can't marry me because she doesn't love me. Then out of nowhere, this bully showed up and almost beat me senseless. Wait until I tell Sheriff Jackson. It was one swing, Reuben said mildly, in an attempt to explain his actions. If you treated Josie like a lady, I wouldn't have needed to do it. This is all your fault, Gilbert raised his voice once more. Josie felt her heart drop as she realized that he had now turned his anger on her again. You have been leading me on and letting me believe that we're going to be married. Then you think you can just drop me because you don't love me? What sort of loose morals do you have? Barton gasped at Gilbert's accusation, and he drew himself up to his full height. Mind what you're saying about my daughter, he said firmly. Josie locked eyes with her mother. She could feel the warm tears running down her cheeks, but she couldn't stop them. I can't go through with this, Ma, Josie wept. I just can't be with a man like him or anyone that I do not love. Louise glanced at Barton, not sure what to say. There would be nothing worse for me than a loveless marriage, Josie continued. She wasn't going to stop until her parents agreed with her. Please, Ma and Pa, can't you see that I can't go through with this? Gilbert doesn't care for me one bit. All he's interested in is getting his hands on Mistletoe Lodge so he can take over and change everything about it that we've worked so hard to achieve. That's not true, Gilbert shouted, giving Josie a stern look. Your daughter is a liar on top of everything else. Now it was Barton's turn to clench his fists, and Louise hastily put a restraining hand on his arm. My daughter, Josie, is nothing like what you've described, Mr. Fry, Barton snapped. She's kind-hearted, hard-working, and would give the clothes off her back to someone in need. Now, get out of here and don't come back. If I'd known for 1 minute how you were going to behave toward my little girl, I would have thrown you out weeks ago. I can't listen to any more of this, Gilbert grumbled as he grabbed his hat from the ground. I don't want anything to do with any of you again. With that, he stamped off, muttering under his breath, and Josie heaved a sigh of relief as she dried her tears. And what about you, Mr. Harris? Perhaps you'd like to explain why you're leaping to defend my Josie, huh? Barton asked, giving Reuben a curious but grateful look. Chapter 13. Reuben took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair to make himself more presentable. I had to come into town for a few last-minute supplies before Christmas. It's not unusual to get snowed in on the ranch, so I figured it would be neighborly to call by. Josie felt a pang of disappointment. Of course, he would want to wish the family season's greetings. It was silly to hope that he had shown up to spend time with her. Well, it's lovely to see you again, Reuben. Why don't you come inside and have some coffee and cake? Louise said quickly, giving her daughter a shrewd glance. If you have time. I expect you're a busy man with a ranch to run. Reuben shifted uncomfortably, and Josie braced herself to hear him tell them that he needed to leave. Actually, there's more to it than that, Reuben said slowly. He gave a soft glance in Josie's direction, and once again, Louise was reminded of when she had first started courting Barton all those years ago. Realization started to dawn on Louise's face, and she took hold of Barton's arm. I'm feeling rather cold, dear. Shall we go inside, and Josie and Reuben can join us in a moment. Why don't you show Reuben the apple tree out back, Josie? I don't think we ever told him how we first came to buy this place. Josie was puzzled by her ma's sudden insistence on going back inside, but agreed willingly. If it meant she had the chance to spend a bit more time in Reuben's company, she would gladly take it. Once Louise and Barton had disappeared back into the boarding house, Reuben seemed to relax. I'm sorry you saw me hit a man, he he said as they strolled through the snow to the back garden. "It's not something I do lightly, but it's not right to treat a woman the way Mr. Fry was behaving toward you." "I can't thank you enough," Josie replied, still faintly queasy at the way Gilbert had pawed at her as though her feelings were of no consequence. "That's 3 times you've saved me now," she added with a smile. "I need to learn to take better care of myself. I don't make a habit of getting into trouble." Reuben seemed preoccupied. "Is it true that you're engaged to be married to him? I didn't realize." Josie shook her head vehemently. "It's what my parents wanted. I had no say in the matter until today." She sighed. "I know they had high hopes for the marriage, but—" Her words trailed off. How could she explain the real reason why she couldn't bear to be with Gilbert? To her surprise, Reuben's expression softened as he suddenly turned to face her, as though he was relieved her upcoming marriage had failed. They were under the apple tree, and he glanced up at the mistletoe above them. It seemed to help him come to a decision. "Josie, the real reason I came into town today was to tell you something." He paused briefly before continuing. "I came to let you know that I have feelings for you. I think about you all the time I'm working, wondering what you're doing." Josie felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized what Reuben was revealing. "I feel the same," she said, deciding that if she didn't tell him now, she never would. A look of tenderness came over Reuben's face. "You do? I've prayed every day that you might, but I didn't dare hope it could be true. When I saw the cougar above you, it made me realize that I couldn't imagine a life without you in it, in some way." "I meant what I said to Mr. Fry," Josie said softly. "It was only by spending time with you that I could see what real companionship and affection could feel like." "And love?" Reuben asked, with hope flaring in his eyes. "I think what I'm feeling for you is love, Josie." The emotion crackled between them, and their eyes locked together as they both recognized the importance of the moment. Josie nodded, and Reuben bent his head, brushing his lips against hers, hesitant at first, but then more passionately as she melted into his embrace. Josie's heart almost burst with joy as their first kiss made everything she had ever yearned for come true. "I didn't want to say anything until I knew if you felt the same way," Reuben said, brushing a tendril of her hair off her cheek as they separated again. "But now that I do, can I ask your pa for his permission to court you properly? I want him to know that I'm serious about asking for your hand in marriage, if that's what you'd like." Josie's eyes sparkled as she smiled up at him. "I think Pa will be delighted. And Ma, too, after she's had some time to think about it." She hoped this was true. Louise had been set on bringing Gilbert into the family, but then it had been her idea to give Reuben some time alone with Josie in the garden just now. "Why were they trying to marry you off to that man?" Reuben asked quietly as they walked back toward the house. "Gilbert was an old family friend," Josie said. "He owns a hotel in the center of town. I think my parents got a little ahead of themselves with their ambition. It would have been a good match for them, but not for me. What they didn't realize was that Gilbert was only interested in our boarding house, not me." It still stung slightly that the entire thing had nearly gone through. Josie knew that she wouldn't have been able to cope with being the wife of a man like Gilbert. Everything about him repulsed her. I suppose it would have made sense, but didn't they want you to find love on your own? "I never had much of a chance. There was always something that needed doing at the boarding house. I never really socialized enough to find a man until now." Josie held Reuben back for a moment before they went inside. "I don't want you to think my parents are unkind. It's not like that. I was always happy to spend my days here helping out, and I admire the way they've built Mistletoe Lodge up. I guess they just forgot that one day I might want a marriage of my own." Reuben nodded with understanding. He could tell that Barton and Louise were good people by the way they had dealt with Catherine. It's easy to let work take over everything. When you join me at the ranch, I promise we'll make time to enjoy other things. It won't be just work. Wallace, my neighbor, is looking forward to meeting you properly. I've told him all about you." Before Josie could reply, the door flew open to reveal her parents standing arm in arm. A smile was already hovering on Barton's lips, and a look of anticipation passed between him and Louise. Mr. Watkins, Mrs. Watkins. Reuben looked down at Josie, and she gave him a small nod of encouragement. The real reason I came by today was to ask for your blessing to start courting your daughter. In fact, it's to ask for her hand in marriage. I own a ranch that I have built from the ground up. At present, it's not perfect, but I'm improving it bit by bit. I understand that maybe you'd hoped for someone who could offer more, but I will do my best to provide for Josie and to love her every day of our lives. You love her, Barton said, and that is all I had ever hoped for when it comes to my daughter. Isn't that right, Louise? He nudged his wife, and they both beamed with happiness. Louise hurried out onto the veranda and folded Josie into an embrace. I made a mistake trying to arrange a marriage between you and Gilbert. Will you forgive me, Josie? I thought I was doing the right thing to give you security. But then your pa reminded me that you can't help who you fall in love with, and I can see you two are very much in love. Josie's eyes misted over, and she blinked back her tears of happiness. I know you had my best interests at heart, Ma. It means a lot that you and Pa have given us your blessing. I'm looking forward to seeing this ranch of yours, son, Barton said, stepping forward to shake Reuben's hand. Perhaps Josie mentioned that she used to work on my brother's ranch most summers. I reckon you'll be surprised at how good she is with the animals. Reuben chuckled. I already got an idea about that when she gave me a few ideas for my breeding stock after I shot that cougar that was about to attack her. Louise and Barton looked shocked as they stared at their daughter. A cougar attack? Giving Reuben advice about his cattle? They both burst out laughing. I think we need to have a cup of coffee and make some wedding plans before you spring any more surprises on us, don't you? As they all trooped inside out of the cold, Barton drew Josie to one side. I meant what I said about wanting you to marry for love, my dear. We're very happy for you. Louise and Reuben waited nearby for them to join them. I've had feelings for Reuben for a while, Josie admitted, flushing a little at so many people hearing of her feelings. I didn't think that I could say anything because we met through Catherine and it didn't seem right. I felt so much guilt in the wake of her death, guilt because of the feelings that refused to leave me. I have mourned Catherine, Reuben spoke up after a moment of hesitation. And I also struggled to admit my growing feelings for Josie so soon after her funeral. But my neighbor, Wallace, said that we can't live in the past. Catherine wouldn't have wanted us to go on living unhappily. He sounds like a very wise man, Barton said, giving them both a fond look. None of us really know God's plan, but perhaps Catherine's legacy was for you two to meet. Without her, your paths would never have crossed. You can remember her with compassion and go ahead and live a happy and fulfilled life together. I believe that's what she would have wanted. Barton's words were like a cooling balm, and Josie and Reuben finally let the last remnants of guilt leave them as their eyes met in a silent agreement to let the past go. Louise and Barton led the way into the parlor. In the corner of the hallway, there was a large Christmas tree with a box of decorations next to it, and Reuben smiled as he saw it. I'm glad your family liked to celebrate the festive season. I missed that since I lost my parents. It's our favorite time of the year, Josie said with a chuckle. We do carol singing around the piano with our guests, and Edith has already started cooking up a feast. Will you join us for Christmas Day? I know you probably have to take care of the animals first, but... Reuben silenced the rest of Josie's comment with a kiss that made her gasp with delight. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Our first Christmas together, my love, and by next year, we'll be married, maybe even with a family of our own. Josie glanced up at the sprig of mistletoe that hung from the beams above them and sighed happily as she rested her head against Reuben's chest. She had tended to so many young women eagerly awaiting their weddings and had been trusted with their innermost hopes for the future. And now, it was her turn to look forward to marriage and children with the man she loved from the bottom of her heart. Do you think Pastor Franklin might be able to marry us soon? She asked, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. Well, Reuben hesitated with a twinkle in his eyes. Now you come to mention it. I did happen to see him on my way here this morning. He told me he's not very busy with weddings on Christmas Eve, Something about the train being delayed back at Hudsonville because of snow. A Christmas Eve wedding? You mean tomorrow? Josie said, her heart full of happiness. I think we've waited long enough, don't you? Reuben looked down into Josie's eyes, seeing only love reflected in them. I can't wait to marry you, Josie. It's like a dream come true. In the parlor, Barton and Louise stood by the window looking out at the mistletoe-covered apple tree, which had been the catalyst for them staying in Rocky River to make a life for themselves. It had started to snow, and the sound of children playing outside drifted through the air. I prayed to the Lord that Josie would find a love as true as ours, Barton said quietly. I know, Louise replied, giving him a warm smile. They'll be very happy together. She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm as the snow started to fall faster, already looking forward to welcoming Reuben into the family. Reuben has asked the pastor if we can be married on Christmas Eve, Josie said breathlessly behind them a moment later. In that case, we'd better get organized. Louise tipped her head to one side as she looked at her daughter. It's lucky I kept my wedding gown. It should be a perfect fit for you. Reuben put his arm around Josie as Louise bustled away to tell Edith the good news. It's almost like it was meant to be, he murmured. Epilogue. Rocky River, Wyoming. 4 years later. As Barton pulled on the reins to bring the wagon to a halt, the door of the log cabin in front of them creaked open, and Josie hurried out to greet them. Merry Christmas, she called. Reuben is just feeding the cattle, but he'll be home as soon as he's finished. Barton climbed down and then helped Louise after him, smiling at the sight of her rosy cheeks. It had been a cold ride out to Shadow Ranch, but nothing would have kept them away. Grandma! Grandpa! A squeal of excitement came from behind Josie's dress, and a little boy darted out, running toward them on sturdy legs. His dark eyes sparkled with mischief, and Barton scooped him up, making him squeal again. How's our favorite grandson? He chuckled, throwing him up in the air. Growing fast, Josie replied, walking more carefully down the steps. Reuben always made sure to sweep the snow off them so she wouldn't slip. But their second baby was due any day, and she hung on to the rail to be on the safe side. I hope you're not overdoing it, Louise said, linking arms with her daughter. I know you're young, but I remember being tired when it was nearly time for my confinement. Eddie is a great help to me. He fetched the eggs from the coop this morning while I fed the chickens. Josie tousled her son's dark curls, and he grinned up at her, holding her hand while they walked back up the steps. He was the spitting image of Reuben, other than the fact that he had inherited the freckles across his snub nose from her. Merry Christmas! A deep voice rang out from by the barn, and Josie's heart lifted with happiness, just as it always did when she saw Reuben. It was hard to believe they had been married for 4 years already, and her love for him was growing stronger with each passing day. I hope the journey out here was all right. Not too much snow to get through. Reuben bounded up the steps, pulling some stray pieces of hay off his coat as he went. He brushed a kiss on Josie's lips and rested his hand around her waist. I've been telling Josie to take it easy, but there's no chance of that with Christmas, I guess. Barton chuckled as Louise handed over a basket of food and gifts to Josie. Growing up in a place called Mistletoe Lodge should have been a clue that Josie's as fond of Christmas as we are. An hour later, they were settled around the table. The candles flickered, giving the cozy log cabin a soft glow, and Reuben sharpened the knife with a flourish to carve the joint of beef that was on a platter in front of him. There was a small Christmas tree in the corner, bedecked with homemade decorations, and pine cones crackled in the fire, sending out their resinous scent that mingled with the mouth-watering aromas from the feast that Josie had prepared. After saying grace, Josie passed the food around and then sat down again. Reuben reached for her hand and squeezed it. He knew how much it meant to her to be hosting their first proper Christmas with her parents. I can't believe we'll be able to stay here with you for a couple of nights, Louise said, looking around the cabin with admiration. You work so hard, but you still found time to add 2 bedrooms over the last year. I couldn't have done it without Josie's help. And Wallace, Josie said quickly, he's coming over with his new wife later this afternoon to have some cake. It was quite the surprise when he told us he'd met a widow in Rocky River, but I'm happy for them," Reuben added. Wallace felt almost like a father figure to him now, and he was glad that the old man had found love again in later life. He didn't have to worry about him being lonesome, and Maud kept him young at heart. They were good neighbors, and he knew it helped to have Maud nearby when Josie was missing her ma. "How is Edith's niece getting on at the boarding house?" Josie asked. "Florence? She's a quick learner," Louise replied. "And her fiancé, Ben, is a great help too. Once they get married, they'll live in the cabin we built out back, which means we'll be able to take life a bit easier. Come out and visit you more often to help with the new baby." "It was a grand idea of yours to suggest Florence might like to come out west," Barton added. "Edith put in a good word, and she's never looked back." He knew how hard Louise had taken it when Josie left the boarding house to live with Reuben on the ranch, not just because of her help, but because of missing her company. But knowing how happy Josie was with Reuben outweighed their sense of loss, and Florence had joined them the previous spring, which had been a great help. As the conversation ebbed and flowed around the table, and Josie felt the baby stirring in her belly, she sighed with happiness. Reuben was everything she had ever hoped for in a husband, kind-hearted and loyal, protective and tender. And she loved her new life on the ranch, especially seeing their efforts to expand the herd starting to pay off. "We'll look after Eddie if you two want to have a few minutes to yourselves," Louise said as they finished the sticky plum pudding, and Barton declared he couldn't fit another thing in. Josie nodded gratefully. There was something she and Reuben needed to do that was just between the two of them. "Let me help you down the steps," Reuben said, gallantly offering his arm to Josie. They walked slowly through the thick snow, past the barn, and along the track to the top of the hill beyond. All around them, the rolling hills were covered in pillowy white snowdrifts, and the afternoon sky was already starting to turn a pale golden pink as the winter sun started to sink in the west. The days were short, but they both knew that the seasons would soon turn again, and spring would return before they knew it. "I brought a posy," Josie said. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a sprig of holly and ivy bound in red ribbon. At the brow of the hill, there was a small pine tree with a cairn of rocks next to it. The wind whispered through the branches, fresh and pure, and Josie smiled up at Reuben before bending to place the posy on top of the rocks. "To our friend Catherine," she murmured, "may we never forget her." "To dear Catherine," Reuben echoed. He lifted his hat off and bowed his head for a moment, remembering the brave young woman who had changed the course of their lives. As they turned to walk away, reflecting on how blessed their lives were, a shaft of winter sunlight lit up the hillside for a moment, and overhead, a solitary eagle soared high in the sky. "If our baby is a girl, I think Catherine would be the perfect name for her," Josie said as she paused to look back up the hill. "That's a wonderful idea." Reuben brushed a kiss on the top of Josie's head as he caught sight of the candles twinkling in the windows of their log cabin. What had been just a dwelling was now a true home and the heart of their ranch, and he silently gave thanks for everything which had led to this wonderful moment. "Merry Christmas, my love," he said, wrapping his arm protectively around Josie's shoulders. "And here's to a lifetime of happiness ahead for our family and us." The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.